He left her there, sick, silent, and alone, in a nursing home chosen for convenience and profit. But Elaine Hale was not the helpless woman Richard believed she'd become. While the world forgot her, she took notes. Every lie, every wound, every stolen dollar, page by page. Months later, on a day meant for smiles and stage photos, she stood before families and cameras and calmly turned their perfect story inside out. What happens when the person you abandoned refuses to disappear? When quiet becomes power. Watch the reckoning no one saw coming. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The rain had been falling since dawn, soft at first and then steadier, flattening the world into a blurred wash of silver and gray. The tires of the silver SUV whispered across wet pavement, sending up thin curtains of spray that caught in the taillights of passing trucks. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of new leather and stale coffee. Richard Hale kept his hands fixed at 10 and 2, the faint glow of the dashboard washing across his long fingers. His gold wedding band turned palm side to avoid catching the light. His jaw worked as though on some silent argument he'd been having all morning. Elaine sat angled toward the passenger window, cheek almost against the cool glass. Her breath fogged and clear with every quiet exhale, her thin shoulders tucked into a cardigan she'd chosen because it didn't smell like the hospital. No antiseptic, no rubber gloves, no trace of recent months. Her skin still held the fragile paper sheen of someone recovering from too many IVs and too little sunlight, but there was a steadiness in the way she held herself, as if whatever waited at the end of this drive required every ounce of contained strength. She didn't look at Richard. She hadn't looked at him much all morning. She studied the passing road signs instead, each green marker vanishing behind them, as though being crossed off a list she kept in her head. Richard's phone buzzed once in the cup holder. He didn't pick it up. His gaze flicked to the screen, then back to the road, jaw tightening another notch. A sigh escaped him, quick and annoyed, but he said nothing. Only the swish of wipers and the muted patter of rain on glass filled the car. Now and then, they passed a landmark Elaine recognized, a weathered barn with its roof half caved in. The exit for a diner where they'd once stopped on a road trip years ago, back when she still wore her hair long, and he still reached over to squeeze her knee just because. She let her eyes follow each thing until it disappeared behind them. She felt no nostalgia, only the strange attachment of someone crossing an invisible border. The heater hummed. A scent of damp wool rose from her cardigan. She shifted slightly to ease a dull ache in her hip, careful not to make a sound that might draw conversation. Richard drove with the careful efficiency of a man on a schedule, eyes always forward, mind already somewhere else. He drummed his fingers once against the steering wheel, caught himself, stopped. They passed a sign for Willow Pines Care Home. 2 miles. The letters blurred with rain, but were unmistakable. Elaine's eyes traced each one until they vanished behind the mist of the tailgate. Her hands, folded in her lap, pressed tighter for a heartbeat and then relax again, palms smoothing the fabric of her skirt in small, controlled strokes. Richard cleared his throat as though to speak, but said nothing after all. The SUV kept gliding forward, rain streaking the windshield like long, silver threads. Elaine turned her gaze back to the trees and let the quiet fill the car, tasting the moment and memorizing its shape. It felt like crossing a river you could not uncross. The lobby of Willow Pine smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and something older underneath. Starch and quiet, the way places do when their walls have seen many seasons of goodbyes. Overhead, soft piano notes drifted from unseen speakers, an old tune slowed to the point of vanishing. The light was bright but cold, fluorescent tubes buzzing faintly behind the drop ceiling. Richard strode to the counter before the automatic doors had fully closed behind them. Water streaked the shoulders of his dark jacket, and he didn't bother to brush it off before taking the clipboard the receptionist offered. He accepted the stack of forms with an impatient flick of his wrist, already uncapping a pen. The pen squeaked softly as it raced across page after page. Insurance authorizations, medical release forms, consent to treatment. He flipped and signed without reading long passages, only scanning where he needed to fill a blank. Behind the desk, Nurse Carla smiled the way people do when trained to be patient. She was somewhere in her 30s, hair tucked into a tight bun, badge swinging slightly as she leaned over to point at highlighted sections. These outline the therapy schedule, she said gently, tapping a paragraph about mobility sessions and occupational assessments. Physical therapy twice a week, group social activities, optional art therapy on Fridays. Richard nodded without looking up, pen moving. His watch flashed when his sleeve slid back, something sleek and expensive. "And visiting hours?" he asked, his tone clipped, as if this were a hotel check-in rather than a life relocation. Carla didn't flinch. 10 to 6 daily. Weekend hours extend to 8. Families are welcome anytime within those, but we appreciate a call ahead for longer visits. Right. Fine. He signed the next page. Elaine had not approached the desk. She had drifted to one of the small seating alcoves along the wall, where a watercolor hung in a cheap gold frame. It showed a farmhouse at the end of a long lane, fields bending in wind. The paint had faded in spots. The sky looked washed out, but there was still a sense of distance in it that made her throat tighten. She stood very still, hands folded in front of her, eyes tracing the crooked fence posts, the small figure in the field. Perhaps a farmer, or simply a shape that might have been anyone. Richard's voice rose a fraction behind her as he handed over a completed packet. Insurance card on file. Advance directive, power of attorney. All there. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," Carla said, riffling through the pages with deliberate calm. "We'll make sure her records are set up properly." Elaine turned slightly at the sound of her name in the conversation, but didn't step closer. She caught Richard glancing at his phone, thumb flicking a notification closed before tucking it back into his pocket. His shoulders looked lighter already, like someone who had checked off an unpleasant errand. Carla looked up and smiled at Elaine with a warmth that tried to bridge the space. "Mrs. Hale will get you settled. Do you have any immediate concerns? Allergies, favorite foods, sleep preferences?" Elaine's gaze lingered one moment longer on the farmhouse before she turned back toward them. "No," she said softly, voice calm and even. "No concerns." Richard tapped the counter twice, a signal of completion. "I'll get her suitcase from the car," he said, and was gone through the automatic doors before Carla could answer. The wet sound of the rain returned briefly as the glass parted and shut behind him. Elaine stepped closer, thin shoulders squared a little under the cardigan. Carla spoke kindly as she clipped the paperwork into a chart. "You'll meet your care team this afternoon. They'll walk you through meals, therapy, and any special requests." Elaine nodded but didn't reply. Her eyes drifted once more to the painting across the lobby as if memorizing it, the quiet road disappearing toward a sky that had room in it. Then she followed Carla toward the hallway that would become her new world. Footsteps soft on polished linoleum, the hush of piano music fading behind them. The hallway narrowed as they walked, its walls lined with framed photographs meant to feel homelike. Wildflowers, sunsets, a dog mid-run. The scent of disinfectant hid beneath a layer of lavender spray that tried too hard. The staff member pushing Elaine's modest suitcase, a young orderly with headphones half tucked in his pocket, hummed softly under his breath, not unkind but distant. The way people are when this is just another task on their shift. They stopped before a plain white door marked with a brass number. Inside waited a room scarcely wider than the bed it contained. The mattress was neatly made in pale green, the dresser lacquered but scuffed on one corner, the single armchair positioned by a window too small to feel like escape. Outside, a square of courtyard grass shone wet from the morning rain, hemmed in by brick walls and hedges trimmed too precisely. Elaine stepped across the threshold slowly, taking in the dimensions with a measured glance. She could stand in the center and nearly touch opposite walls. The room felt borrowed rather than owned, a waiting place rather than a life. Still, she smiled faintly, a small polite reflex aimed at no one in particular. Richard came in behind her, phone already in hand, thumb moving quick across the glass. He didn't look at the room for more than a heartbeat. His gaze swept it, bed, dresser, chair, window, and moved on uninterested. He checked his watch next, a fluid motion that said his real world lived somewhere else entirely, where meetings and calls would resume once this inconvenient errand concluded. The orderly slid the suitcase against the dresser and stood waiting for dismissal. "There's an extra blanket in the top drawer, ma'am," he said, voice kind but distracted. Lunch is at noon. Nurse Carla will stop by to go over meds. Thank you, Elaine answered quietly. Richard didn't respond. He was scanning his phone, smirking faintly at something that appeared there, maybe an email or message that had nothing to do with her. Elaine's eyes found the window. The glass was fog at the edges from rain outside, a thin bead of moisture tracing downward. Beyond it, the courtyard looked empty, slick flagstone path curling around a birdbath without birds. She stepped closer, fingers trailing across the sill, and tried to latch gently. It didn't budge. "Does the window open?" she asked, turning slightly toward the orderly. He shook his head. "Sorry, no. There's sealed climate control and safety." Her hand lingered another moment on the cool pane before she let it drop. "I see." Richard glanced up briefly then. Not enough to catch her expression, just long enough to confirm this was handled. "You'll be fine," he said, as if declaring something decided. "Everything you need's here. They've got your medications, therapy, meals." His voice carried the tone of someone handing over a package. Job complete. Elaine nodded once. She didn't say she'd already noticed the hum of the vent above, the faint damp smell in the corner, the way the curtain rod sagged. She didn't say that she had measured how far the windows sat from the bed, how the light fell across the small table, where one might sit and write. She simply sat on the mattress, smoothing the thin coverlet beneath her palm. Richard's phone buzzed again. He swiped, smiled faintly, and slipped it away. "I should go," he said. "Conference call." For a heartbeat, she looked up at him. Something unreadable flickered there, and vanished before he could interpret it. "Of course," she replied softly. He leaned in to brush her cheek with a kiss that missed and landed near her temple. "They'll take care of you," he said, and was already turning for the door. Elaine watched him go. His shoes tapped a crisp rhythm down the hall, fading into the hum of distant voices and rolling carts. The orderly murmured a perfunctory goodbye and left her alone. Silence filled the room quickly, thick and unbroken except for the faint whisper of the vent. Elaine turned back toward the sealed window and the wet courtyard beyond. She reached for her cardigan collar and pulled it closer around her neck, then exhaled slowly, letting the air leave her lungs in one deliberate thread. The sound was almost a sigh, but not quite. She opened her suitcase carefully, placed a small leather notebook on the dresser, and sat back on the edge of the bed. Her eyes returned to the window once more, lingering there long enough for her own reflection to appear against the rain-slick glass. A thin woman with watchful eyes looked back, not defeated, only quiet. Outside, the courtyard gleamed under a weak shaft of light, pushing through the gray. After a long while, she reached over and turned on the small lamp, softening the cold fluorescence overhead. The room was still narrow, still sealed, still borrowed. But something subtle shifted in the air, not comfort, not surrender, simply presence. She was here now, and she was watching. The phone rang just as Richard was straightening the cuff of his jacket, a vibration first, then the brittle chime echoing too loud for the small room. He glanced at the screen, expression flickering into something alert and businesslike, and without a word stepped back into the hall. The door swung almost closed behind him but didn't latch, so the thin slice of space let Elaine hear the shape of his voice, low, brisk, softened only slightly for whoever was on the other end. She caught fragments. "Yes, back by 2. Tell them the paperwork's done." Then a pause and something that sounded like a quick laugh, one she hadn't heard from him in months. She stayed seated on the bed, palms flat against the coverlet, listening to the muted exchange, the vent whisper overhead, and somewhere down the hall a cart rattled past, rubber wheels squeaking faintly with each turn. The ordinary sounds of the building seemed louder now, filling the space where his presence had just been. When the door opened again, he had his phone in one hand, keys in the other. His face was drawn tight, but not with grief, with focus, as if a long list of obligations waited just beyond the parking lot. He didn't come far into the room, just enough to stand clear of the threshold. "They'll take good care of you," he said, the words flat in practice, like something he decided would suffice. Elaine lifted her head and studied him for a quiet moment. He didn't meet her eyes long enough to feel it. His glance slipped past her to the suitcase, the dresser, the shut window, then back to his phone. She thought he might sit, even for a minute, but he didn't. She opened her mouth as though to answer, and then closed it again. What could she say that he would hear? That she noticed how quickly he adapted to her absence, how easily the morning drive and the signatures had become logistics. That she remembered every little act of caretaking she had done for decades, the meals, the birthdays, the long hospital nights, and how strangely quiet it felt to be dropped here like luggage. The words sat unspoken and heavy, because she understood he had no space to hold them now. He slipped the phone back into his jacket pocket and gave a small, almost formal nod, the way one might after concluding a meeting. Then he turned. No touch of her shoulder, no lingering scent of his cologne. No small pause to fill the doorway with the shape of regret. Just shoes on polished floor, receding. Elaine's gaze followed the door until it clicked softly behind him. A beat later, the outside world announced itself. The beep of his car unlocking, the hollow slam of a door, the ignition turning over. She imagined his hands on the wheel, already answering some call or planning where to stop for lunch. And then the sound she dreaded came. Tires rolling slowly across the gravel drive, crunching, fading. She didn't move for a long time. The room felt heavier without even his distracted presence to stir the air. A drip of rain traced the outside of the sealed window, sliding crookedly before vanishing into sill. Her hands, still on the bedspread, smoothed an invisible wrinkle once twice, as though calming something restless beneath her ribs. She looked at the doorway where it stood and tried to imagine what it might have been to hear the door close differently, to feel a palm against hers, to catch even a small goodbye. Instead, there was only the quiet hum of the building and the echo of tires that had already found their way back to the highway. After a while, she exhaled, slow and steady, and turned her head toward the little window again. Beyond it, the courtyard puddles gleamed, reflecting a sliver of gray sky. She studied them until the ripples settled and the surface went still, and in that stillness, something inside her seemed to settle too. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but a clear understanding of the day. She had been left, and she was still here. She reached to the nightstand and slid open the drawer, checking its neat emptiness, then closed it again. Her eyes swept the room once more, measuring space, light, the reach from bed to chair to window. She folded her hands in her lap and listened as the sound of his SUV became nothing at all. The silence stayed with her, but it was hers now. The first days blurred into one another, quiet and careful, like pages turned without sound. Morning began with a soft click of the door and a cheerful aide in pale scrubs, always the same scripted greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale. How are we today?" Blood pressure cuff sliding over her arm, thermometer beep against her ear, a clipboard filled in with quick slanted handwriting. Sometimes they asked about sleep or appetite, but it was polite habit more than curiosity. Elaine answered softly, never volunteering more than needed. Breakfast came on a plastic tray rolled to her bedside, oatmeal, fruit cup, tea already cooling. She ate slowly, alone, listening to hallway sounds drift in whenever the door stood ajar. Wheels squeaking, a patient laughing somewhere down the corridor, the squeal of a laundry cart's brakes. By mid-morning, the building's rhythm had revealed itself. Vitals at 7, pills at 8, round at 10. She took the offered walks too, careful and unhurried. An aide would appear, usually young and underpaid, offering a crooked elbow. "Let's stretch those legs, Mrs. Hale." She'd smile faintly and comply, moving past rooms like hers, each door half open to glimpses of other lives, a television droning low, an old man tracing his fingers along a photograph, a woman with curlers asleep under a blanket printed with daisies. The corridors were long and painted the same tired beige, lined with railings scuffed by years of hands seeking balance. To anyone watching, Elaine seemed mild, compliant, exactly the sort of resident who wouldn't cause trouble. She thanked staff softly, never complained about bland food or slow call buttons. But behind her steady gaze, she was learning the place. She watched how the shift changed at 3, who lingered to chat and who hurried through tasks. She learned the names stitched on uniforms. Carla the day nurse with gentle hands. Vicky on nights, brisk but watchful. Martin from maintenance who stopped to adjust her heater without being asked. Some details she wrote down in a small leather notebook she'd tucked in her dresser, though always when no one was watching. Notes about who forgot to lock the med cart, which doors were propped open after cleaning crews passed, what supplies ran short. Not because she planned to use it, not yet, but because seeing clearly steadied her. She also mapped what was broken and stayed that way. The call light near the far shower room, blinking but never ringing. The loose tile under the north stairwell exit. The vending machine in the rec room that kept swallowing dollars. Each flaw felt like an opening, a tiny proof that this place was not as airtight as it tried to seem. Meals were a time to listen. At her table, some residents complained mild, weary grievances about cold eggs or missing sweaters. Elaine kept quiet, but her ears caught everything. A nurse joking too loudly about overtime cuts, an orderly muttering about cameras that didn't work. People forgot she was there, or assumed she was harmless. At night, when the halls hushed and the only sound was the distant rattle of a cart or the soft ring of a phone at the nurse's station, she would sit by the window that didn't open and watch the courtyard lights flicker. She thought about the rhythm of the place, how every system depended on people who were tired and rushed. She thought about Richard too, but only in passing, as one might think about a storm already spent. She began to feel a strange clarity, a slow sharpening behind the quiet exterior. If she could map this world, she could survive it. If she could understand who held the keys, who cut corners, who listened when no one else did, then she would not be invisible. Not really. By the end of the first week, she could tell which aides would pause if she asked a question, and which ones pretended not to hear. She knew the exact time the medication cart rattled past, and that Nurse Carla always paused to retie her ponytail before stepping into room 12. She even knew the smell of the linen closet, and how long it took for the night staff to answer an unscheduled call light. To anyone else, Elaine seemed still and diminished, a woman shrinking into institutional life. But in truth, she was awake in every moment, watching and learning, building a quiet map in her mind. Each observation a thread she tucked away, not knowing yet where it might lead, only that it mattered to know. Lunch was the one time the building seemed to stretch and breathe. The long, bright cafeteria filled slowly each day around noon, walkers scraping against linoleum, wheelchairs clicking forward one careful push at a time. The air smelled of chicken soup and reheated rolls, the hum of conversation layered over the steady clatter of trays. Elaine came early enough to claim a small table near the edge, a spot that let her see the whole room while appearing politely out of the way. She ate slowly, never rushing through the beige chicken or pale peas. People stopped noticing her after the first week. She was quiet, her movements small, her gaze often lowered, but her ears stayed open. In a place where everyone assumed silence meant ignorance, it was easy to disappear and just listen. Nurses often came through in pairs to grab quick coffee or steal a roll before heading back to the med cart. They spoke softly at first, but the low cafeteria din gave them cover. Elaine learned to catch voices that drifted across the tables. "Did you hear about the supply order? Cut again. They're saying we're over budget, but we're short gloves." Another voice laughing, sharper. "Administrator's new car says otherwise." They'd lower their heads and smirk, unaware of the thin woman at the corner table tracing circles on her paper napkin. Families came and went too, dropping by for lunch with parents or grandparents, sometimes staying long enough to gossip while residents napped in wheelchairs. One afternoon, two sisters whispered fiercely over their mother's untouched sandwich. Mom swears her brooch is gone. That sapphire one. The younger sister's voice trembled between anger and worry. I told the nurse's desk. They acted like it's nothing. The older one shook her head and murmured, "Lock everything up? I don't trust this place." They fell silent when a staff member passed, then resumed once footsteps faded. Elaine chewed her soft bread slowly, storing every word. Even the aides, exhausted from morning rounds, loosened their masks at lunch. She overheard them comparing pay stubs, shaking their heads over missing overtime hours. "They say the budget's tight, but we're drowning." Half staff called off again. One rubbed her wrist with a glove elastic, had left a raw line. "I swear if payroll comes up short again, I'm done." They laughed tiredly, but the laughter sounded more like survival than humor. Elaine kept her expression mild, her posture small. Inside, she was building connections like puzzle pieces. Administrator's new car, missing jewelry, payroll delays. None of it formed a full picture yet, but she felt the shape of something behind the bland walls. Some afternoon, she would glance across the room to find someone else watching too, Marjorie, the retired accountant with sharp eyes, sipping her tea and scanning the room like a hawk disguised in a quilted jacket. They had not spoken much, only a nod here and there, but there was recognition in it. Two quiet women gathering what everyone else let slip. When lunch ended and aides began the slow, gentle procession back to rooms, Elaine lingered a few minutes longer, pretending to fuss with her napkin or adjust her cardigan. Snatches of talk floated by like scraps on wind. State inspectors due next month. Cut the art therapy budget. Families complaining. She collected each one silently. Back in her room later, she would sit by the sealed window and write in her leather notebook. The nurses' names, the rumors, the family's fears. She didn't judge or rush. She simply recorded. It felt like holding on to pieces of truth in a place built on routine and distraction. The meals were bland, but the room was alive with currents no one else seemed to notice. Elaine understood now that listening was a kind of power, even if no one suspected she had it. Day by day, with each quiet lunch and murmured complaint, the map in her head was growing clearer. Marjorie's presence announced itself not with sound, but with the crisp snap of her cardigan sleeve as she folded herself into the chair across from Elaine one gray afternoon. The cafeteria had thinned. Most residents had drifted away for naps or television. Only the quiet lingered, punctuated by the squeak of a mop somewhere down the hall. Marjorie sat straight-backed, her hair the soft yellow-white of worn linen, her eyes bright behind square glasses. She looked like someone who had balanced ledgers all her life and still did, even now, with every conversation. "I've been watching you," she said without preamble, voice low enough not to carry. "You don't waste words. You're paying attention." Elaine didn't answer at first. She glanced up, measuring the woman who had spent the last week sitting a few tables over, sipping tea and scanning the room with accountant precision. Marjorie's gaze held no malice, only shrewd curiosity. Elaine gave a small nod, an opening but not a confession. Marjorie leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands folded like she was about to share a trade secret. "Most folks here keep their heads down, too tired or too trusting. You're neither." She paused, studying Elaine's still face. "I used to audit companies. Fraud, waste, payroll tricks. I can smell it, and I smell it here." Elaine's brow moved, just barely. Marjorie took that as permission to go on. "Head nurse's office," she said quietly, tilting her chin toward the north wing. "Locked cabinet behind the desk. Not med storage. That's elsewhere. This one's different. Thick file folders, billing statements, medication charts, maybe records they don't want the state to see." She let the words hang, eyes flicking to the doorway to check for passers-by. Elaine traced the rim of her teacup, silent but listening. "They're cutting corners," Marjorie continued. "I've seen the supply orders shrink. Gloves, wipes, even meds, less than what's billed. Families paying for services their parents never get. And jewelry goes missing. I hear it every week, and there's never a paper trail." The information settled into Elaine's mind like a stone dropped into deep water, quiet but heavy. She didn't react outwardly, only turned slightly to glance toward the north hall, where the head nurse's door sat closed and polite under its little frosted window. "I'm old, but not stupid," Marjorie said, sitting back now. "I filed complaints before. They vanish. You'll learn that soon enough." She took a sip of tea, watching Elaine with the faintest smile. "But maybe you're different. You keep notes, don't you?" Elaine met her eyes for the first time. No denial, no confirmation, just a steady gaze of someone who had learned long ago that silence was stronger than easy answers. Marjorie nodded once, accepting the unspoken. "Good," she said softly. "Keep them safe. Keep them quiet." The conversation ended as simply as it began. Marjorie rose with the slow care of aching knees, tucked her chair back in place, and left without looking over her shoulder. Elaine remained at the table for a while, watching the rain streak the far windows. Her pulse had quickened though her face betrayed nothing. A locked cabinet, files, numbers that might explain the whispers she'd been collecting like stray threads. She felt the old familiar clarity, the one she used to have when balancing their household books and finding where Richard's little evasions lived. Back in her room later, she wrote, * North Wing, head nurse office, locked cabinet, billing, meds, missing jewelry rumors. * she pressed her pen harder than usual, the line darker on the page. Then she closed a notebook and slid it under folded clothes. From the window, she watched the courtyard lights flicker on against the early dusk. Somewhere behind those beige walls was a cabinet with secrets, and now she knew where to look. She didn't yet know why that mattered or what she might do, only that knowledge itself was a small kind of armor in a place built on routine and control. She was finding cracks, and she intended to remember everyone. Saturdays carried a softer hum at Willow Pines, a lazy drip between breakfast and lunch where the building felt less clinical and more like a quiet community center. That morning, while Elaine was reading by the sealed window, she heard the faint strum of guitar chords echoing down the hall. The sound was hesitant but bright, a teenager's attempt at something warm in a place too often muted. Sam appeared a few minutes later, tall but still growing into himself, with shaggy hair half tucked behind one ear and a faded t-shirt with some band logos she didn't recognize. A volunteer badge swung crookedly from his neck. He peeked into her doorway, smiling with the awkward gentleness of someone who'd been told to check in on residents but wasn't sure how. "Hey," he said, "you like music?" Elaine closed her book carefully, marking the page with a scrap of paper. "I used to," she answered, voice mild. He laughed softly, stepped in just enough to lean the guitar case against the wall. "Well, I'm supposed to, brighten the day, play some songs. But mostly people just fall asleep on me." That made her smile a little, the first real smile in days. "You might have better luck than you think." He played anyway, standing near the window where a patch of pale sun cut through. Simple chords, a quiet melody that stumbled once or twice, but recovered. It was enough to shift the air in the small room, to make it feel less like a ward and more like a place someone might choose to be. When he finished, she clapped lightly and his ears went pink. "You're better than you think," she said. "Thanks," he muttered, ducking his head. After a pause, he added, "So, do you need anything? Like books from the library or, I don't know, tech help? I'm kind of the default computer guy here." The question lingered longer in her mind than he realized. She hesitated, then asked as casually as she could, "Tech help? Does this place have Wi-Fi?" He brightened, glad for a topic. "Sure, there's guest Wi-Fi, but it's garbage. Staff one's way better." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Most of the residents don't know about it." "Is it difficult to get the password?" she asked, tilting her head just enough to seem curious, not scheming. He grinned, the grin of a kid happy to share a secret. "Not at all. They literally taped it under the library desk. You just flip up the keyboard shelf and bam, post it with a login." He pantomimed pulling an invisible sticky note. Elaine's face stayed politely blank, but something flickered in her eyes, a small, calculated note tucked away. "That's good to know," she said, almost offhand. "Yeah, totally," Sam said, already strapping his guitar back on. "And there's a printer in the activity room, too. Kinda old, but it works. You can print forms or whatever." She nodded, filing that detail with the rest. "Thank you, Sam." "No problem, Mrs. Hale. You want me to play one more before I go?" "Please," she said, and this time her smile reached her eyes. He played a short, cheerful tune, clearly one he practiced more. Elaine listened quietly, letting the sound fill the narrow room. It wasn't just music. It was also a small door opening, a reminder that information lived in unexpected places. When he left, she returned to the window and watched him head down the hall, lanky and harmless, waving at another resident. Only when she was alone again did she open a leather notebook and add 2 careful lines. Staff Wi-Fi. Password under library desk. Printer and activity room. *. She closed the book gently, hands resting on the cover for a moment. Sam had no idea what gift he'd just given her. A thread of connection to the outside world, a tool, but Elaine knew. Quiet, polite. Forgotten Elaine was learning how the place worked. And now, with a single cheerful visitor and an unguarded secret. The walls around her had shifted just slightly further apart. Night came softly at Willow Pines, but not quietly. The building had its own after-hours voice, a low thrum of vents, the sigh of distant doors, muted wheels gliding on polished floors. Elaine discovered that she liked this version of the place best. Visitors were gone, staff thinned out, televisions dimmed to murmurs behind closed doors. From her narrow bed, she could see the faint glow of the courtyard lamps through the sealed window, pale yellow spilling across slick brick and wet grass. She waited until the last round of checks had passed. A nurse's glance, the light touch of the thermometer, a "Sleep well, Mrs. Hale." Then the hallway hushed again. She reached into the top drawer of her dresser and drew out the little leather notebook, brown with soft edges, something she'd slipped into her suitcase almost as an afterthought. It had lived for years in a desk at home, empty but for 2 or 3 forgotten grocery lists. Tonight, it would begin to earn its keep. She turned on the reading lamp, shading it carefully with her palm so it spilled just enough light across the bed. Then she opened to the first clean page. For a long time, she stared at it, listening to the building breathe. Her first entry was not grand, only a date and a time. June 14th, vital 7:10, meds 8:25, supposed to be 8 o'clock. She wrote in a neat, unhurried hand, the accountant's influence of Marjorie unconsciously shaping the page. Beneath it, she added, lunch charge $5.50 on statement. Only tea taken. The act of writing steadied her. It was not anger, it was clarity. Each fact placed precisely, no commentary, no flare of emotion. She felt herself slipping into an old skill. The household books she'd once balanced while Richard built his empire, the doctor's notes she kept during long treatments when every pill and appointment had to be exact. She flipped back the receipts she'd tucked into her bag. Printed invoices from check-in that showed strange line items, mobility assistance premium, extended dietary care. Things she hadn't requested. She copied them down carefully. Admission surcharge $40. Unclear. Outside, a cart rattled faintly. Then silence again. Elaine kept writing. Asterisk Carla. RN gentle listens. Vicky. Night RN brisk. Efficient but forgets pain meds. Asterisk she listed staff names with quick descriptors. Nothing personal. Just the truth as she'd observed. Then the small details. Asterisk room call light delay. 12 minutes, 6:13, 2 a.m. Med card unlocked briefly. June 14th morning. Aide distracted. Asterisk she wrote without fear but with precision. The way someone knots rope, patient, deliberate, knowing someday it might matter that each twist is tight. When she paused, the page already looked alive with quiet order. She studied it for a moment, head tilted, and felt an unfamiliar sensation. Not power exactly, but steadiness. In a place where she had been deposited like luggage, here was one thing wholly hers, her record, her truth. She turned off the lamp and sat in the dim afterglow. Outside, rain began again, tapping softly against glass that could not open. She listened to it the way one listens to an old friend telling something difficult but important. Then she slipped a notebook beneath her pillow, a small, secret weight against her shoulder. Sleep came more easily than she expected. The act of documenting had built a thin wall between her and a helplessness that threatened to creep in. Tomorrow she would wake, smile politely, eat bland eggs, and listen more. But tonight she had begun something. Each line on that page said she was not invisible, not silent, not erased. And though no one in the world yet knew it, a quiet record had started, one she intended to keep. The first letter began one sleepless night, when the moonlight pooled across the floor like spilled milk, and the building was so still it felt abandoned. Elaine lay awake listening to the quiet groan of pipes, the occasional creak of wheels far down the hall. She had been thinking all day about Marjorie's warning in the locked cabinet, about the odd charges she had copied into her ledger. The weight of unspoken things pressed against her chest until she sat up and turned on the small lamp. The paper she used came from a stationery set she brought almost without thinking, a floral border, lined sheets crisp and smooth. She dated the top in small, precise numbers and wrote the first name that came naturally. Susan Ortega. ESQ Susan had been her friend since college, the one who had gone on to law school while Elaine married Richard and built a quieter life. They hadn't spoken in years, But she could picture Susan's voice, brisk and clear, the way she used to cut through confusion. She began with facts, where she was why what she had noticed. Each sentence was deliberate. Asterisk, there may be billing irregularities. I have observed medication mishandling. Families whisper about theft. Asterisk, she wrote a locked cabinet. Of unpaid staff overtime, of the culture silence. She stopped often, pen hovering, aware that if she chose to send it, the letter would be the first stone thrown. But tonight she wasn't ready to throw anything. She only needed to see the truth arranged in ink. When she finished, she folded the pages neatly, slid them into an envelope, and wrote Susan's name, but not the address. The envelope went into the bottom drawer, under a stack of folded sweaters. Just knowing it existed steadied her. The next night she wrote again, this time to people who had once been Richard's world. The two company partners she'd hosted for dinners in another life, men who still held power in the firm that bore Richard's name. The letter was cool and factual. You should be aware that Willow Pines, where your partner places wife, is engaging in practices that may expose clients and families to legal and financial harm. She listed a few specifics, but held back the most damning details. This was not a weapon yet, only a draft. She sealed that letter too and tucked it away. There were other starts, one to the state health department, another to the local newspaper editor, whose column she'd read online after Sam taught her how to reach the staff Wi-Fi. Each letter was a skeleton, a map of what she could one day set in motion. She wrote them not out of fury but discipline. The same discipline that once let her sort bills, plan treatments, keep life intact while Richard built his career. But each envelope stayed sealed. She was not rushing. She understood power came not from shouting, but from knowing when to speak. For now, she was still gathering names, dates, numbers, small human details. Late at night, after the last word dried on the page, she would hold the folded paper for a moment, feeling its quiet weight. It was proof that she was not passive, not erased. Then she would hide it and turn off the lamp, letting the dark return. Morning always came the same way. Aides bustling, trays clattering, polite greetings at her door. She smiled, gentle and unremarkable, and tucked the night's work deeper under sweaters. No one who looked at her saw the stack growing, letters like coiled rope waiting in silence. She told herself she would know when the time came to break a seal. Until then, she would keep building, one page at a time, careful as a mason laying stones in the dark. The accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon, when the halls were heavy with the after-lunch lull. The smell of reheated soup still hung faintly in the air, and most residents had drifted back to their rooms or gathered in the sunroom to watch an old black-and-white film. Elaine had chosen to linger in the hallway outside the activity room, savoring the quiet while she stretched her legs along the rail. That was when she heard the sharp metallic squeal followed by a dull thud and a cry that split the monotony. She turned quickly and saw Mrs. Talbot, a frail woman with white hair pinned in perfect coils, crumpled beside her wheelchair. One foot twisted awkwardly beneath her, her face shocked more than pained at first. The wheelchair had rolled half a length away, one brake hanging loose, the other still locked. Elaine didn't think. She moved. Kneeling beside the fallen woman, she placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and spoke softly. "You're okay. Stay still for now." She glanced down the hall and called for help, voice clear but not panicked. A young aide appeared almost at once, wide-eyed and already flustered, radio clattering against her hip as she knelt opposite Elaine. I told them that brake was loose," the aide muttered under her breath while checking for injuries. Then, catching herself, she looked up and forced a professional calm. "Mrs. Talbot, we're going to get you comfortable and checked." Other staff arrived, rolling a gurney, speaking in practice reassuring tones. Elaine stepped back, letting them work, but her eyes caught every detail. The dangling brake cable, the aide's nervous swallow, the quick glance toward the security camera bubble overhead. She saw the head nurse arrive last, her face set in careful neutrality, eyes sweeping the scene like a chessboard. Minutes later, Mrs. Talbot was wheeled away, shaken but speaking, her foot elevated and wrapped in ice. The hall emptied as quickly as it had filled, leaving behind the wheelchair. Elaine moved toward it slowly, examining the broken brake with the curious detachment of someone memorizing rather than interfering. She could see the frayed strap and the faint smear of oil on the wheel. No one came to remove it. When she returned to her room, the notebook was waiting. She wrote, Asterisk 2:17 p.m. Mrs. Talbot fell. Right brake detached. Aid warned before. Head nurse observed. Camera present. Asterisk the lines came sharp and clean, her pen steady. That evening, she noticed a change. Through her open door, she saw 2 staff members push the broken wheelchair away. Later, when she walked toward the lounge, she passed the nurse's station and caught a glimpse of paperwork, an incident report, top sheet handwritten. The narrative already softened. Resident slid from chair. No equipment malfunction noted. The aide who had muttered earlier stood stiff nearby, signing the report with a face gone blank. The head nurse's pen hovered as she murmured instructions too low for Elaine to hear. Elaine paused just long enough to see the form stamped and filed. Then she moved on as if uninterested, but inside something shifted. It was one thing to suspect corner cutting. It was another to watch reality bent and sealed on paper. Back in her room, she added more to the entry. Astor's report altered, no malfunction. Aide signed but hesitant. Head nurse controlled narrative. Asterisk, she closed the notebook and sat for a long time with her hands resting on its cover. Outside, dusk was falling across the courtyard, shadows stretching long over wet brick. Elaine felt the weight of what she was collecting, not gossip, but evidence. Quiet, patient truth that no one else seemed to want to hold. It didn't feel like vengeance. It felt like insurance, like air in a sealed room. Later, as she brushed her hair and prepared for bed, she thought of Richard. She wondered if he imagined her fading into passivity here, if he pictured her blank-eyed and medicated, disappearing into routine. She looked at the closed notebook on the dresser and felt a cool, silent strength pulse through her. She was not fading. She was watching. And tonight, she had written something that mattered. Her birthday arrived without fanfare, announced only by the date printed on the small wall calendar the activities Aide had tacked near her door. No one at Willow Pine seemed to know except Nurse Carla, who glanced at her chart and offered a quick, kind smile that morning. "Happy birthday, Mrs. Hale," she said as she took vitals. Elaine thanked her softly, but the words felt thin, floating away in the sterile air. By afternoon, the mail cart came rattling through the hall. It was pushed by a young man with earbuds in and a bundle of envelopes clutched in his hands. He stopped briefly at her doorway and dropped a single cream-colored envelope onto her nightstand before moving on. No packages, no flowers, just that one envelope with her name typed neatly in a font she didn't recognize. Elaine turned it over slowly. The return address wasn't Richard's home, but the corporate headquarters of his firm. The glass building she'd visited only once for a holiday party, back when she still wore the ring he'd chosen, and smiled at partners who shook her hand as if she were a pleasant accessory. The embossed logo glinted faintly under the lamplight. She sat for a long moment just looking at it, thumb tracing the heavy paper. When she finally opened it, the inside was worse than she'd imagined. A mass-produced birthday card, expensive stock, but utterly empty of thought. "Warm wishes on your special day," it said in a silver script pre-printed above the embossed company crest. No signature, no handwriting, no scrap of him anywhere. The envelope had been machine sealed. Even the postage label looked printed by a secretary or automated system. She stared at it until the letters blurred. A single drop of rain traced down the outside of the sealed window, and she followed its path instead of the words. Then she folded the card closed with careful precision, as though handling something fragile but meaningless. Her leather notebook lay open on the dresser where she had been writing earlier about a new rumor Marjorie shared. More missing valuables, another family quietly furious. Elaine picked up the card, hesitated only once, and then slid it between 2 filled pages. It made a soft whisper as it disappeared among the facts and times and names she'd been gathering. She pressed it flat, the company crest vanishing into her secret archive. It wasn't anger that burned in her chest. Anger was too hot, too brief. What she felt was something colder, deeper, a quiet recognition of distance. Once upon a time, Richard would have chosen a card himself, would have scrawled a note in his brisk, slanted hand. Maybe even sent flowers to remind her he saw her. But this outsourced gesture was worse than forgetting. It said clearly that she existed only as a file to be managed. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. She went to lunch, where Sam the volunteer played his guitar for another table. She listened to aides gossip and smiled faintly at Marjorie across the room. No one knew it was her birthday. No one asked. That felt almost preferable to what she had received. That night, when the halls quiet and the glow of the courtyard lamps reached her bed, she touched the notebook again, fingertips brushing the spot where the card rested hidden. It wasn't evidence in the way broken brakes or false invoices were, but it belonged there all the same. Proof not of corruption but abandonment, of the deliberate way Richard had chosen to be absent even when pretending presence. She closed the book and set it on the dresser, the leather cool under her palm. The card's thin weight joined the growing story she was writing without telling anyone. A ledger didn't have to hold only numbers. It could hold truth, too. The kind that one day, if needed, would speak for her when others tried to erase or diminish what had happened. Before she turned out the lamp, she let herself imagine, just briefly, Richard signing something without looking, an assistant licking the envelope. The card dumped into a bulk mail run. That was who he had become. She let the picture settle, sharp and unsentimental, and then she let it go. Tomorrow she would wake and keep listening. She would add to her quiet record. But tonight, as she slid under the thin blanket and felt the ache of the day fade, she allowed herself one small, steady promise. She would remember, even if no one else cared to. Saturday drifted in on a ribbon of late morning sun, pale and thin across the courtyard glass. Elaine was by the window, finishing a line in her ledger, when a familiar shuffle of sneakers and the low hum of guitar strings came from the hallway. She looked up just before Sam appeared, tall and awkward as ever, his badge askew and his hair untamed. He gave her a sheepish grin and a little wave before tapping lightly on the doorframe. "Morning, Mrs. Hale," he said. "You up for some music?" Elaine closed the notebook without hurry, slipping it under a folded sweater on the dresser. "Always," she replied with a small smile. He set down his guitar and launched into a soft, unpolished tune, something warm and full of teenage yearning that filled the narrow room with a life it usually lacked. Elaine listened, watching his hand stumble once and recover, noticing how his eyes flicked up for approval when he hit the chorus. She clapped gently when he finished, and the tips of his ears turned pink. "You've improved," she said. "Trying," he shrugged, then brightened. "I found out you can request songs. Next time I'll learn something you like." "That's kind," she murmured. She hesitated, then decided now was the moment. "Sam, may I ask you something a little unusual?" His eyebrows lifted in curiosity, but his expression stayed open. "Sure, what's up?" "I'd like to send a letter," she said slowly, choosing each word with care. "Not a real one, an email, but I'm out of practice, and I think it might need scanning. Is that something you could show me?" His whole face softened into an easy smile. "Of course. That's easy. We've got a scanner built into the copier in the library. It's old, but still works. And email simple." Elaine let herself exhale quietly. "I wouldn't want to cause trouble." "No trouble at all," he assured, pushing his guitar aside and moving closer to the little table by her chair. "Do you have an account?" She shook her head. "Not anymore." "Okay, let's fix that." He pulled out his phone and perched awkwardly on the edge of the chair, walking her through the steps with a casual competence only kids seem to have. He showed her where to tap, how to create a new address. She picked a username that was simple and quiet, nothing that tied back to Richard or their life before. He didn't question it, just helped her choose a strong password, typing slowly so she could follow. "Now, when you scan," he explained, "the machine will ask for an email. You type this in. It sends you a PDF. Then you can forward it anywhere." She nodded, listening intently, her hand still but her mind racing ahead. PDFs of invoices, of letters, of whatever she might need later. "You're quick," he teased, watching her navigate the tablet with surprising ease. "I managed household books for years," she said softly. He grinned. "You'll be a pro in no time." Then his smile shifted to a gentle seriousness. "Just maybe don't send anything to anyone here. Privacy's not super tight on the guest Wi-Fi. Her eyes lifted to his, surprised by the instinctive protectiveness in his voice. Thank you for telling me. No problem. He reached for his guitar again, but paused. You know, you're different from most folks here. You pay attention. Elaine didn't answer that. Instead, she said, Thank you, Sam. This means a great deal. Happy to help. He strummed a little riff, casual again, but something quiet and respectful had passed between them. When he left, she closed the door softly and turned to the small slip of paper where she'd written her new address in neat block letters. She tucked it into the back of her ledger, behind the sealed birthday card and the growing record of this place. For a long time, she sat with her hands on the closed book, listening to the hum of the vent, the faint echo of Sam's guitar fading down the corridor. She felt, for the first time in weeks, a subtle widening of space around her. Not freedom, not yet, but access. A small door opened because she'd had the quiet courage to ask, and a boy with an easy smile had trusted her enough to answer. When she finally rose to wash her cup and prepare for lunch, her reflection in the sealed window looked steadier. Still pale, still thin, but lit somewhere deep behind the eyes. The world beyond these walls had not vanished. She had just reached a thread of it, and that thread might one day pull much more into the light. It happened on a day when rain drummed steadily against the long corridor windows and the cafeteria buzzed a little louder than usual. Families visiting to break the gloom. Elaine sat with her usual tea cooling between her hands, eyes lowered but listening, when Marjorie slid into a chair beside her without asking. The older woman moved carefully, one hand steadying the edge of the table, but her eyes were sharp and lit with something almost mischievous. Marjorie didn't waste words. She set a thin bundle of papers on the table, face down, smoothing the edges with fingertips that still remembered spreadsheets. Thought you might like these, she murmured, voice just enough above the cafeteria noise to reach Elaine's ears alone. Elaine glanced sideways, but didn't touch the bundle yet. What are they? Copies, Marjorie replied, lips barely moving. Financial records. Old billing statements. Picked up before they started locking everything tighter. She gave the smallest shrug. I have my ways. Elaine's eyes flicked over papers. The top sheet bore the Willow Pines logo and lines of numbers, columns of charges and dates. It looked exactly like the invoices she'd begun collecting for her own room, but here were other names, other accounts. How? She asked quietly. Marjorie's mouth curved into the hint of a grin. Printer in the admin office spits duplicates if you don't cancel quick enough. People never check the tray. I walk slow and read fast. Elaine almost laughed, but it came out as a soft exhale. She turned a page just enough to glimpse what was there. Mobility surcharge, special care upgrade, daily therapy support. Some of the listed services matched the whispers she'd heard at lunch tables. Yet here they were attached to residents she knew barely left their rooms. Charges no family would have signed off unknowingly. She didn't linger too long. Instead, she straightened the stack and slid it toward her lap, as if simply clearing the table. Thank you, she said quietly. The two words waited. Marjorie gave a slight nod, eyes glinting behind her glasses. I trust you to keep them safe. I'm old enough they'll call me senile if I complain again. But you've got something steadier in you, and you write things down. Elaine didn't confirm or deny. She only let the faintest smile touch her mouth, a smile without warmth but full of recognition. They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea as if they were just two women passing time. Around them, the cafeteria swirled with talk, one table debating TV channels, another complaining about bland soup. None of it touched their quiet exchange. When lunch ended and aides began shepherding residents back to rooms, Elaine stood, tucking the papers neatly under her sweater. Marjorie reached out, brushed a crumb from the table, and murmured, "Careful where you keep them." "I will," Elaine replied. Back in her room, she locked the door, a habit she'd adopted quietly, though no one seemed to mind. She laid the papers out on her bed, smoothing each one until the stack became a neat grid of evidence. She scanned line after line. Residents billed for premium meals while served the same bland trays she saw daily. Charges for therapies canceled months earlier. Unexplained adjustments that always seemed to add rather than subtract. Her pen moved across her ledger, adding each entry with patient precision. Names, amounts, dates. When she finished, she gathered the whole set, wrapped it in a plain folder, and slid it deep under her folded clothes at the back of the dresser. She felt the cool leather of her notebook and placed the folder beneath it, layering the truth she was building. Then she sat back on the bed and stared at the sealed window. The rain had slowed to a fine mist, droplets weaving slow paths down the glass. She thought about the tiny acts that made something like this possible: a woman who still noticed printer trays, a volunteer willing to share Wi-Fi, her own habit of recording and saving. Alone, each was small. Together, they formed a quiet web. When evening rounds came, she greeted the nurse politely, the very image of compliant resident. After the door shut again and she was alone, she rested a hand over the hidden folder, feeling its thin weight like a new heartbeat under the quiet hum of the room. It wasn't yet a plan. She still didn't know what shape her collected truths would take. But she knew this. The story that Willow Pines and Richard had counted on, the story of her fading, her harmlessness, was false. And with each piece she tucked away, that falsehood thinned just a little more. It was Marjorie who planted the first hint without meaning to. They were sharing tea by the wide cafeteria window when she mentioned that the administrator had left early for a board session. The phrase pricked Elaine's ears. She'd never asked about governance here, but of course a place like Willow Pines must have one. People somewhere deciding how much staff to hire, how to price a room, what to bill. Marjorie chuckled bitterly and said, "It's not all doctors and nurses behind this place. Money men, too. Golfers." That word, golfers, stayed with Elaine all afternoon, circling quietly as she returned to her room. Richard's life had been filled with golf courses and whispered deals, with partners and clients cultivated over long afternoons on manicured greens. He'd loved that ritual more than anything, and she spent years trailing in its wake, hosting dinners for men whose names she had learned to file away without asking too much. She wondered now if one of those names was hiding here, in the architecture of her quiet exile. Days later, the answer surfaced by accident. Sam had come by again, laptop under his arm this time, because the printer was jammed. He was chatting while working on a volunteer report, showing her how to scroll through the facility's public webpage. It was meant to be harmless, an online photo gallery, a list of programs. But Elaine noticed a small link buried at the bottom. Board of Directors. "Can you click that?" she asked casually. Sam obliged, tapping open a grainy PDF of smiling headshots and titles. She leaned closer, breath slowing as her eyes scanned the names. Third from the top, Graham Lockhart, partner, Hale and Lockhart Consulting. She didn't react outwardly, but the world seemed to narrow and sharpen. Graham Lockhart, Richard's longtime golfing companion, a man who had sat at her dining table, telling crude jokes over brandy, the one who sent him anniversary wine every year out of habit more than affection. Sam was still talking, something about volunteering credit, but Elaine barely heard him. She made a quiet sound of acknowledgement and let him continue. Later, after he left, she reopened the board list alone and read every word. Lockhart wasn't just a director. He sat on the finance subcommittee. He had likely been in the room when Richard mentioned needing a place for his wife's long recovery. It was easy to picture. Two men with cigars at the club, Richard describing the burden of care, Lockhart promising comfort and efficiency. And perhaps, while at it, a premium care package pitched under the banner dignity, but built for profit. Elaine felt something cold and clear settle through her. She went to her ledger and wrote with measured strokes, asterisk board, Graham Lockhart, Richard's partner/friend, finance, possible incentive in placement and upgrades. Asterisk, she paused, then added, golf tie, probable influence and admission speed. For the first time since she'd begun writing, her hand trembled slightly before she steadied it. The betrayal felt layered, not just Richard casting her off, but in placing her in a system greased by old friendships, ensuring his convenience and their profit while she bore the silence. That night, she couldn't sleep at first. She lay in the dark listening to distant television laughter from another room, the hiss of the vent. Her mind replayed summers of waiting for Richard to come home from golf, Evenings of polite nods to Graham Lockhart, memories she'd buried under decades of small survival. They hadn't just abandoned her. They had brokered her placement like a business expense. But grief did not stay long. Slowly it turned to something steadier, harder to name, perhaps resolve. She sat up, switched on the reading lamp, and studied a line she'd written until they looked less like wound and more like data. Facts had power. She knew this from the years of managing household budgets no one else bothered to check. She opened a draft letter to Susan Ortega, unfolded it, and added a line. Conflict of interest. Lockhart on board. Facility selection tied to Hale and Lockhart Network. Then she folded again and returned it to the bottom drawer, still unsent but sharper now, cleaner in its aim. By morning she was outwardly the same. Calm at breakfast, smiling faintly when Sam waved. But inside, something important had crystallized. She was no longer only mapping small cracks. She had traced one vein all the way back to Richard's world. She now understood the ease of her admission, the inflated charges on her invoices, the quick promises of comfort. It wasn't just neglect, it was design. She kept her face mild and quiet, but the ledger on her dresser grew heavier that day. Each fact was a quiet nail driven home. One day soon, when the time came to open the letters, she would know exactly where to aim. The announcement came the most ordinary way, slipped under her door with the morning vitals sheet and a plastic cup of pills. Elaine found on the floor when she rose to draw the curtains, a glossy flyer printed with balloons and smiling stock photos of families gathered under a banner. Family Appreciation Day. Bring loved ones. The heading sang in bright, childlike fonts. Below, a list of promises. Live music, catered lunch, photo booth, an award ceremony for our treasured residents. She carried it to the chair and sat down slowly, reading every word while the light strengthened across the courtyard. There was a date, 3 weeks away, and a line encouraging families to RSVP. Her eyes caught on the smaller print at the bottom. Invitations have also been emailed to registered contacts. She didn't have to guess who that meant. Richard's name would be somewhere on the list, attached to her file as the responsible party, the paying spouse. The idea of him receiving a cheerful note, "Join us to celebrate the ones you love," felt almost surreal, but then, she thought, that was exactly the kind of effortless performance he liked. Show up for an hour, shake hands, be photographed looking caring and devoted. If he bothered to come at all, it would be to reassure others more than her. She read the flyer again, slower this time. Each promise glittered with a thin coat of marketing cheer. But beneath it she felt something else. An opening. Families present. Press possibly invited. Sometimes local papers cover these events for feel-good human interest. Speeches, gratitude, microphones. A day designed for show, but show could be turned inside out if one prepared. Elaine folded the page carefully, aligning its edges with deliberate precision. She did not crumple or discard it. She smoothed the creases until the flyer was a neat square and slipped it into the back pocket of her ledger. Then she sat for a long while, still in her nightrobe, staring at the shut window. For weeks she had been collecting. Invoices, names, whispers, photographs of broken equipment Sam had quietly helped her print. Drafts of letters lay sealed and waiting. She had told herself she didn't know when she might act. But now, a day had been offered. A stage disguised as kindness. When the aides came for vitals, she smiled as usual, mild and grateful. When she went to breakfast, she listened but said nothing. But her mind had shifted into an almost electric focus. 3 weeks. Enough time to gather clean copies of the most damning charges, to refine her notes into something undeniable, to call Susan as she dared and arrange her presence quietly. Enough time to decide how to stand without shaking when the moment came. After lunch, she went to the library under the pretense of borrowing a book. Sam was there, hunched over his laptop. She asked casually if the staff printer could handle multiple pages, if he might help her scan a few keepsakes. He didn't question it, just nodded and promised to show her again. Back in her room, she wrote in the ledger, Astor's Family Day, July 12th. Families, press likely. Opportunity. Asterisk, the single word steadied her more than any pep talk could. She spent the rest of the afternoon assembling a mental list, not yet on paper, not where it could be found. Photographs of Mrs. Talbot's broken chair. Copies of the old billing statements Marjorie had passed her. Screenshots of the board list with Lockhart's name highlighted. Even the birthday card with its coal company crest. She would decide later what to show and what keep hidden. But the architecture of the day was clear. A celebration bill for appearances could become a reckoning if truth were ready to walk in. That night, she lay awake long after lights out. The flyer smoothed beside her on the nightstand. Rain tapped softly at the glass, the same steady rhythm that had carried her here. She thought about Richard opening his email somewhere, perhaps on a phone in an airport lounge, skimming the invitation, and deciding whether to bother. She imagined his careless RSVP, his belief that she was docile, contained. She turned the flyer over and studied the blank back. In the faint lamplight, her face reflected against the window pane, thinner than before, but sharp-eyed. She touched the ledger once, feeling the growing weight inside it. No one here knew that she was building something. They saw a quiet woman who never complained, whose birthday had passed without fuss. But in 3 weeks, on a day of balloons and speeches, she might hold the room in her hands. Elaine slipped the flyer into the ledger and closed the cover with a firm, calm motion. The plan was not yet finished, but for the first time it existed. Not revenge. She didn't need revenge. But truth. She wanted to stand once and speak clearly, to leave no one mistaken about what had been done and by whom. Then she turned out the lamp and let the dark return, steady and purposeful. 3 weeks was both long and short, but she had learned patience long ago. The call itself took her half a morning to gather the nerve for. Elaine sat at the narrow table beneath the window with the flyer for Family Day folded neatly beside her ledger. Her new email address was scrawled on a scrap of paper, but this would not be an email. Some things deserved a voice. She turned the borrowed facility phone over in her hands twice before dialing, the plastic receiver cool against her palm. It had been more than a decade since she and Susan Ortega last spoke, back when their contact was Christmas cards and the occasional shared memory from college days. But the number was still etched in her mind from those years when Susan was her emergency call, the one she phoned about mortgage papers, about a frightening medical bill, about the first hint of Richard's hidden accounts. She listened to the ring and nearly hung up on the third tone, heart quick in her chest. But then came the familiar voice, brisk and warm all at once. Susan Ortega. Elaine closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Susan, it's Elaine, Hale." A pause, then a sharp inhale. "Elaine? My God, it's been forever. Are you all right?" "I'm safe," Elaine said carefully. "But I'm at a long-term care facility now. Willow Pines." She let the words settle, half expecting judgment or questions. Instead, Susan's tone softened but stayed professional. "What happened?" "It's complicated." Elaine drew a breath. "Richard placed me here after the last hospitalization. I'm recovering, but—" "Susan, something's wrong with this place." There was silence on the line, the kind that meant Susan had shifted into lawyer mode, listening with both heart and calculation. "Go on." Elaine didn't rush. She began at the beginning. The odd charges on her intake forms, the broken wheelchair brake and the rewritten report, the gossip about missing jewelry and slash supply orders. She described the locked cabinet in the head nurse's office and the board list with Graham Lockhart's name. Her voice stayed even clinical, but every detail landed like small pebbles hitting water. "Jesus, Elaine," Susan said at last, the first crack of raw anger leaking through. "This is negligence at best. Fraud. Maybe worse. Are you safe right now?" "Yes," Elaine said quietly. "I'm safe. I'm careful. Do they know you're keeping records?" "No, and I intend to keep it that way." Another pause, then Susan's voice steadied. "You've done exactly what you should, documented. But you need outside eyes before you move. I want to see these records myself. Are you asking for counsel or just advice?" "Both," Elaine admitted. The word felt heavier than she expected. Susan exhaled, a sound half sigh, half battle cry. "All right, listen to me. I'll come. I'll say I'm an old friend visiting. No one here will question that. I want to review what you have before Family Day. We'll decide how to proceed, but I don't want you confronting anyone alone." Elaine sat very still, letting the promise soak through the quiet room. "You would do that?" "You're my friend," Susan said simply. "And this is exactly the kind of thing I fight for." "You're not alone, Elaine." For the first time in weeks, something broke loose inside her, a knot she hadn't realized was strangling her breath. She pressed her fingers to her eyes and let the tears gather but not fall. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Just keep everything safe and quiet. No hints to staff, no complaints on the record. We'll do this clean." "I understand." "And Elaine," Susan added, voice gentler now, "I'm proud of you. You're sharper than they think." Elaine swallowed hard and managed a small sound assent. They made a plan. Susan would visit under the guise of an old college reunion trip next week. She'd bring a portable scanner, legal pads, a mind honed by years of depositions. They'd sit quietly, maybe over tea, and build a real case. After the call ended, Elaine sat with the receiver in her lap for a long while, listening to the blood in her ears and the low murmur of the hallway beyond her door. The room felt changed, not bigger but sturdier, anchored by a lifeline stretching beyond these walls. She wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve, then reached for her ledger. On the next clean page, she wrote in neat, deliberate letters, asterisk call, Susan Ortega. Coming June 27th. Legal review before Family Day. Asterisk, she paused, then added a small check mark beside it. Not completion, but confirmation. A step taken. The window glass caught her reflection as she closed the book. She looked almost the same, pale, slight, cardigan neat, but her eyes no longer seemed to drift. There was focus there now, and something like relief folded carefully inside the resolve. When evening came and the cafeteria filled again with clatter and gossip, Elaine moved through it with the same quiet presence as always. But now, deep in her chest, she carried the knowledge that she was no longer alone with her ledger and drafts. Someone else believed her. Someone with power was coming. And that changed everything. The first hint came before breakfast, when the night aide who usually hummed while she wheeled the vitals cart past Elaine's doorway without a sound. There was a strange hush to the hall, an alertness, as if the building itself had stiffened. A few minutes later, Elaine overheard two voices by the nurse's station, pitched lower than normal but carrying anyway. "State's here," one said. "Now!" Unannounced. Then quick footsteps, the creak of the stairwell door. Elaine stayed very still in her chair by the window, heart steady but sharpened. She didn't allow herself to feel triumph. She only listened. A complaint had been filed. She had done it carefully, weeks earlier, through the state's anonymous online portal, using the Wi-Fi Sam showed her, and an email address with no trace to her name. She kept it precise and dry. Billing irregularities, equipment safety, unexplained medication delays, potential retaliation toward staff. No accusations, just facts. Whether this visit tied to her action, she couldn't know. But the timing, just days before the grand family event, felt too exact to be chance. At mid-morning, she saw him. A man in a navy windbreaker with a state seal stitched on the chest, clipboard tucked under one arm, badge clipped to his pocket. His face was mild, not aggressive. A quiet bureaucrat's face used resistance. He moved slowly down the corridor, stopping to look at wall charts, to ask questions too soft to catch. Behind him hovered the head nurse, smile taut and eyes scanning like searchlights. By noon, the place was shifting underfoot. Housekeeping bustled harder, wiping already clean surfaces. Aides walked straighter, voices clipped. At lunch, the usual chatter about TV shows and family visits fell off when he entered the cafeteria. The inspector spoke to a few residents gently, leaning down to hear, nodding, writing notes. When he came near Elaine's table, she kept her gaze calm and open, but not eager. He greeted her with a polite nod. She returned it. Nothing more. He passed on. Yet she saw his pen pause when Mrs. Talbot mentioned the chair accident. Just a single murmured phrase, "my break," before a younger aide quickly hushed her with talk of dessert. The man's brows drew slightly together as he wrote. Behind performance of calm, tension thickened. In the afternoon, Elaine overheard staff whisper in the lounge. Billing records locked. Administrators on the phone. Why today? Someone speculated about an anonymous tip. Someone else muttered about lawyers. She returned to her room, closed the door, and sat with her ledger on her knees but didn't open it. Instead, she stared at the page where Susan's visit was marked. The pieces were moving sooner than expected. She thought about whether the complaint would flush out records or scare Richard's friend on the board, but mostly she felt the air changing, that small electric shift when hidden things first touched daylight. By late afternoon, the inspector was gone as quietly as he'd arrived. No speeches, no drama. Just a mild, "Thank you for your time," at the desk, and a car pulling away into the drizzle. But the building did not return to normal. It buzzed with rumor and unease, as if some protective shell had cracked. Dinner that night was subdued. Even Sam seemed to sense the shift. He came by briefly, guitar case still strapped across his back, and whispered with a grin too wide to be casual. "You feel it? They're spooked." Elaine allowed herself the smallest nod. She spent the evening methodically. She checked the scans she had stored on her hidden USB. Invoices, names, the board list with Lockhart highlighted. She organized copies into one slim, neat folder ready for Susan. She didn't know what the state might pursue or what they would leave untouched. But she knew her own file would remain intact and sharper than ever. Before lights out, she sat by the sealed window, watching rain thread silver under the courtyard lamps. She imagined Richard somewhere reading an email about a possible state visit. Maybe a call from Lockhart assuring him it was nothing. She pictured the way men like them dismissed trouble until it arrived fully formed. She felt no rush, only calm. Family Day would still come. She would still be ready. But now she understood something deeper. This story wasn't hers alone anymore. A small voice had reached a larger world and stirred it. Quiet could travel far when it was disciplined and precise. When she finally slid under the thin blanket, she let the day replay once, slow and careful, then closed her eyes. There was power in what had happened, not loud, not finished, but real. Somewhere beyond her door, people who thought they controlled every page had just learned one could be turned without their permission. Early the next morning, before the aides finished their first coffee and before the hallway filled with carts and chatter, Elaine was awake and dressed. She moved with deliberate quiet, every action measured. The folder she had built over weeks lay open on the small table. Clean copies of invoices with unexplained surcharges, photographs of broken safety equipment. The board roster with Graham Lockhart's smiling headshots circled in neat red ink. The printed flyer for Family Day folded once and tucked at the back. On top, she placed a single page she had typed the night before. A concise, neutral cover letter written in language she knew Richard's world would understand. Notice of potential liability and conflict of interest regarding resident care at Willow Pines Care Home. No emotion, no accusation, only facts and the words legal notice typed in bold across the top. She slid everything into a heavy manila envelope and sealed it with slow, firm pressure, running her fingers along the flap until it held. The second envelope waited beside it, slightly thinner but with the same contents minus one or two personal details. That one she addressed not to Richard but to the Metro Gazette, the small but sharp-eyed local paper that sometimes ran investigations when the city got lazy. She left the return address blank on both. When the first light touched the courtyard, she tucked the envelopes under her cardigan and stepped into the corridor. To anyone watching, she was just another resident going for an early stroll. But Sam had shown her where the small staff mail drop sat, a slot in the administrative wing used for outgoing post. She timed it carefully. Breakfast prep noise was beginning, but the admin hall was still mostly empty. She paused once at a corner, listening. Then she walked on, posture unhurried, and slipped the first envelope into the slot. It slid away with a soft sound, vanishing into the dark of the bin below. The second followed. For a heartbeat, she stood there with her hand still on the cool metal, a quiet current running through her. Fear, yes, but also an unfamiliar steadiness. She had just put her story into motion. On her way back, she passed a housekeeping cart. The woman pushing it nodded kindly and kept moving. No one looked twice. Elaine returned to her room, closed the door gently, and let herself sit. Her hands trembled for the first time all morning, a tremor quickly stilled by slow breathing. She made tea, the ordinary act grounding her. When the cup was warm in her hands, she wrote in her ledger, *June 29th. Mailed 2 sets. Corporate HQ and Gazette. No return. After she underlined the date once, a single line, and closed the book. The ledger felt heavier now, but in a satisfying way, as if some of its burden had shifted outward. The rest of the day moved almost normally. She attended the morning exercise class, chatted briefly with Marjorie about crossword clues, accepted Sam's grin when he dropped by with his guitar. No one suspected, but she could feel the faint hum of risk trailing her. Somewhere in the next few days, letters would be opened, brows furrowed, phones lifted. Richard's assistants would carry the envelope into his office, place it neatly by his coffee, and he would see his own firm's name printed on legal letterhead from a stranger. At the Gazette, perhaps some junior reporter would open the second packet and feel the tug of a real story, money and neglect hiding under cheery brochures. Elaine didn't picture any scene of confrontation or drama. She only pictured paper in hands that mattered, quiet ripples starting to spread far beyond the sealed room. By nightfall, she felt strangely light. Not safe, not yet, but no longer contained. The story was no longer hers alone, locked in leather and fear. It was traveling, sealed and silent, but unstoppable. She left her lamp burning an extra hour, sipping tea and looking out at the courtyard lights. When she finally laid down, the silence of the room was different, not oppressive, but watchful, alive. Somewhere beyond these walls, events had begun to move, and Richard Hale's careful distance had just been breached by a single quiet act. The plan turned practical in the small hours of a rainy Tuesday, when the corridors were still, and only the hum of vents and the drip of distant plumbing broke the quiet. Elaine spread her papers across a narrow bed. Invoices marked up in red pencil, the wheelchair brake photograph, Marjorie's salvage billing statements, printouts of the board list with Lockhart's name circled. But loose papers were a risk. She needed order, something she could hold in her hands and close quickly if anyone knocked. When Sam arrived that afternoon, guitar on his back, she asked him to come in and close the door. He blinked, startled, but obeyed. "I need your help again," she said softly. "Printing. A few pictures." He hesitated just long enough for her to add, "It's about safety here." Something in her tone, quiet but absolute, made him nod without another question. He followed her to the small library and showed her again how to load files to the clunky staff printer. They worked side by side, mostly in silence. Elaine had already scanned the items days before. Now she chose which to print. The snap brake rod from Mrs. Talbot's chair, photographs of cracked shower rails, images of bruises on a man's forearm taken discreetly by Marjorie after fall. She printed her own billing statements, showing therapy charges never given, side by side with neighbors' identical meals labeled premium. Each page slid out with a heavy, damp warmth that smelled faintly of toner. Sam stacked them carefully and finally broke the quiet. "This is bad, isn't it?" "Yes," Elaine said simply. He glanced at her and then away. "I won't say anything." "I know," she replied. "But if anyone asks, you were helping me make a family scrapbook." He gave a small, tight smile, understanding the script. "Got it." Back in her room, she spread the photos and documents on the table and took her time. She trimmed edges so everything lined perfectly, wiped away stray pencil marks, slid each page into a clear plastic sleeve. Slowly, deliberately, she built a binder, black vinyl, plain, the kind executives carried to meetings. Into its front pocket, she slipped a single white sheet that read only observations. Willow pines, June, July in a crisp font. When the binder was finished, she sat back and studied it. Closed, it looked unremarkable, something an accountant or visiting attorney might carry. But inside it was a clean, devastating record. Sam came back just before leaving for the day and peeked in. "Looks official," he said with a low whistle. "It needs to be," Elaine answered. She smoothed her palm across the cover, feeling the cool plastic under her hand. "You're going to show it to somebody?" She nodded once. "Someone who can make it count." He didn't press. "If you need more pictures or scans, just tell me before Friday. I can sneak in again." "Thank you, Sam." His grin was shy but firm. "You remind me of my grandma. She didn't let people push her around either." Elaine almost laughed but swallowed it. Then she was wise. After he left, She slid the binder onto the small shelf beside her ledger and sat quietly for a long time. She thought of Susan coming soon, of the inspector's mild face, of the letters already traveling through the mail. She thought of Richard's polished shoes crossing the lobby on Family Day. The fear was still there, of being dismissed, of retaliation, but now it ran under something steadier. Preparation. She had taken chaos and turned it into a narrative, page by page, until it was undeniable. That evening she did something she hadn't done since arriving. She put on a bit of lipstick before dinner, just enough color to feel like herself. At the table, she nodded to Marjorie, who winked knowingly though they didn't speak of what was hidden in Elaine's room. Later, in the hush after lights out, she opened the binder again just to feel its weight. She imagined handing it across the table to Susan. Imagined the lawyer's sharp eyes flicking through pages and the small, satisfied nod when she reached the end. She imagined, too, a quiet moment on Family Day when someone important, maybe Richard, maybe the administrator, would realize she had not been powerless or blind. She closed the binder and set it beside the ledger. 2 books, one personal, one bill for battle. The room felt different now. Less like a holding cell, more like a war room waiting for its hour. Outside, the rain slowed to a fine mist against the glass. Elaine listened to it until she could breathe evenly again. Then she turned off the lamp and lay back. Her hands relaxed on the blanket. Sleep came easily for once. She had work yet to do, but the shape of the fight was real in her hands. The day before the celebration dawned too bright for July. Hot light pouring across the courtyard and showing every flaw the staff had tried to ignore. By mid-morning, the air was alive with nervous energy. Men in maintenance polos hustled up and down ladders, replacing ceiling tiles and tightening railings that had wobbled for months. New rugs appeared over old scuffs. Someone polished a brass nameplate at the entrance until it gleamed like it hadn't in years. Elaine watched the commotion from her chair near the window, outwardly patient but inwardly cataloging each panic fix. Only days ago the place had moved at its usual slow shuffle. Now aides were brisk, faces tight with whispered orders. She'd seen the administrator sweep through twice already, all smile and sweat, trailed by a young assistant with a clipboard and too many questions. They were staging a version of Willow Pines meant for outside eyes, a single clean day to distract from what had been ignored. At lunch, the menu suddenly boasted roast chicken instead of the usual beige stew. Fresh flowers brightened the tables. Residents looked bemused at the extra attention, though a few like Marjorie only smirked knowingly. Nothing like company coming to make the house tidy, she murmured to Elaine, low enough not to carry. The hours passed in a quiet hum of preparation. Banners went up in the lobby, cheerful script about family and gratitude, and a rented photo booth was assembled near the piano. Elaine noted the cost of all this gloss with detached curiosity, no doubt billed somewhere as resident engagement. She didn't feel anger anymore, just a cool clarity. They were nervous. Good. Near dusk, as aides wheeled and used equipment out of hallways and wiped down baseboards no one would ever inspect, Elaine returned to her room. She pulled the curtains halfway and sat at her small desk. The binder rested ready, its black spine sharp against the pale wood. She opened it once more, flipping through until she reached the end. Each page sat square and legible, every photograph crisp. She adjusted nothing. It was already as clean as it could be. When the facility quieted and the heat of the day broke, her phone rang. The room's landline, an old beige plastic thing she rarely used. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she saw the small, glowing number she knew by heart and felt her chest tighten, but not in the way it once had. She let it ring twice, 3 times, then picked up and set it gently back in cradle. She would not answer. Moments later, the voicemail light blinked. She pressed play and listened to Richard's voice fill the tiny room. Casual, warm in that old, practiced way, but distant. "Hey, Elaine, just checking in. Big day tomorrow, huh? They say you're doing better. That's great. I'll swing by around noon. We'll catch up. Maybe take some photos for the newsletter or whatever they've got planned. Anyway, see you tomorrow." He ended without pause for her reply, as if expecting silence. The line clicked off and left only the buzz of the air vent. Elaine sat very still, eyes on the binder's black cover. Once, that voice would have made her ache. Now it simply confirmed what she already knew. He was coming not out of love, but to appear attentive, to manage a narrative. He expected a quiet, compliant wife to smile for the camera and disappear again. She reached over and pressed delete, watching the red light wink out. Then she stood, slow and calm, and moved the binder from desk to dresser, sliding it into the canvas tote she'd borrowed from the library under the excuse of book returns. It fit snugly, invisible beneath a scarf. Night settled over willow pines. Somewhere down the hall, a TV played an old sitcom laugh track. She brushed her hair, took her evening pills, and turned the flyer for Family Day face down on the nightstand. Lying in bed, she let her breathing match the steady hum of the building. Fear still threaded her veins. Tomorrow would be public, unpredictable, but it felt manageable. She had done what she could. Letters mailed. Records clean. Susan on her way with a lawyer's mind and a quiet promise. Even the state's sudden visit had softened the ground. Tomorrow, the man who thought he'd safely stored her away would walk into a room she now controlled. She pictured it without heat, only precision. Richard's easy smile faltering when he realized she was not passive, the administrator's careful veneer cracking under quiet facts. She turned off the light and let darkness fold around her, cool and steady. The eve of something waited just beyond the sealed window, and for the first time since that ride through rain weeks ago, Elaine felt not discarded but deliberate. The keeper of her own story, poised to step forward on her terms. Sunlight spilled over the grounds of willow pines with a clarity that felt almost staged, a golden sweep that lit the trimmed hedges and freshly washed windows. Cars began to arrive early, one after another crunching across the gravel drive. Sedans polished for the occasion, minivans with balloons tied to side mirrors, a few high-end SUVs like Richard's. Through her window, Elaine watched the procession with the quiet focus of someone measuring more than she admired. Children hopped out clutching gift bags. Grown sons and daughters guided parents with walkers. Laughter floated up in thin, bright threads, nervous and expectant. She had risen before dawn, long before the first engines, and moved slowly through her small space. The pale blue dress hung ready on the closet hook, simple, soft at the waist, one she had worn years ago to a friend's garden party, when Richard still reached for her hand in public. She smoothed it over her frame, thinner now but steady. On the nightstand lay her wedding ring. She had taken off long ago, a silent surrender at some forgotten moment of hurt, but today she slid it back onto her finger, not for him, for the story. People read symbols before they listen to words, and she needed the appearance of the wife he believed he'd abandoned but who had not abandoned herself. The canvas tote sat on the chair unassuming. Inside, wrapped in a folded scarf, the black binder rested beside the smaller leather notebook. She touched it once before leaving, a calm press of her palm, the way one checks the weight of luggage before a long journey. Downstairs, the lobby had been transformed overnight. Tables lined with flowers and glossy brochures stood beside a rented espresso cart. The air smelled of pastry and furniture polish. Staff wore their crispest uniforms. Smiles gleamed a fraction too wide. A string quartet in the corner tuned softly, bow hairs whispering across strings. Elaine moved among the others slowly but without hesitation. Marjorie, dressed in a cardigan of deep plum, gave her a conspiratorial glance. Sam appeared briefly, hauling folding chairs with other volunteers, and when their eyes met, he dipped his head just enough to say, "I see you." At the far end of the hall, the administrator hovered with his young assistant, scanning arrivals like a host at a fragile party. His gaze brushed over Elaine, paused a heartbeat, then moved on, polite, dismissive. Good. Families filled the reception area, hugging, murmuring, settling residents at decorated tables. Cameras flashed as aides snapped photos for the newsletter. Elaine found a quiet seat near the windows, tote by her chair, and let the noise wash around her. She was invisible enough to work. Just before 10, a familiar shape appeared in the doorway. Tall, well-groomed, gray at the temples but still commanding. Richard in a navy sport coat and loafers, phone in one hand, sunglasses perched carelessly. He scanned the room until his eyes landed on her. For a flicker of a second, he seemed surprised. She looked upright, composed, dressed not as an invalid but as a woman he used to bring to company dinners. Then his expression clicked into its usual charm. He strode forward, arms out just enough to look affectionate without commitment. "Elaine," he said warmly when he reached her. "You look good. Really good." She smiled a small, measured smile, neither inviting nor cold. "Richard." He leaned to kiss her cheek, a brief practice touch, and stepped back. "Big day," he said, sweeping a look around the room. "They've done it up nice." "Yes," she replied softly. She gestured to the seat opposite. "You found time to come." "For you?" "Of course." He sat, already pulling out his phone to silence notifications, and glanced at the tote without interest. "They said you're improving." "I'm glad." She didn't answer, and silence folded briefly between them, the first real silence they'd shared in years. Around them, families chattered and staff hovered, but at their small table a cool stillness took root. Elaine kept her hands in her lap, her wedding ring catching a thin bar of sunlight. She watched him notice it, saw something flicker, guilt, maybe surprise. Before he masked it, more cars kept arriving outside. The drive glittered with chrome and color. Inside, the first announcements of the program crackled over the PA system. Richard looked up, scanning the banners and music with a faint smirk. "Let's get through the speeches, and then we can talk," he said, not asking but assuming. Elaine only inclined her head. She had no need to correct him. The morning had broken clean and bright, and everything was exactly as it should be. The binder hidden but ready, the stage dressed for joy, the players in place. She turned toward the wide windows where sunlight flooded the courtyard and felt the steadiness she had built, layer by layer, settle into her bones. Today would not be spectacle for them alone. Today could belong to her. She took a sip of the tea an aide had brought and let the hum of the room fill her ears. When the music paused and the microphone crackled to life, Elaine slid one hand to the tote, not to pull anything out, but just to feel its presence. A silent ally waiting. Whatever came next, she was no longer the woman left in rain on the side of a road. She was ready. Richard entered the lobby like a man stepping onto a familiar stage. His shoes clicked against the polished tile, a sound just loud enough to announce his presence without seeming deliberate. Beside him trailed a young man in an expensive but slightly ill-fitted suit, the kind of eager junior associate Richard liked to keep close. Someone to drive, carry bags, and witness his generosity. The associate glanced around with cautious curiosity, clearly out of place among wheelchairs and paper banners. Richard, though, looked perfectly at ease, radiating the confident warmth that had once charmed investors and dinner guests alike. Elaine saw him coming long before he reached her table. She had chosen a seat that faced the main doors. It mattered to watch first, to own the moment rather than be startled by it. She watched him pause at the welcome desk, offer the administrator a handshake that lingered just long enough to suggest importance, and accept a name tag he would never wear. His smile was bright, teeth just a shade too perfect, his tan deliberate. When his gaze finally swept across the room and found her, his expression shifted in a subtle, practiced way. Surprise recalibrated into affection. He approached with open arms, though not so wide as to invite witnesses to think a heartfelt. The young associate hung back, eyes lowered, phone ready in his pocket as if half expecting to document something. "Elaine," Richard said as he arrived at her table. The single word floated with a warmth that felt manufactured but polished from years of practice. She rose halfway, enough to be polite. His hands came forward, one finding her shoulder, the other reaching to brush her arm as he leaned in for a light kiss on her cheek. The scent of his cologne, expensive and faintly citrus, was the same he had worn decades ago. Elaine did not flinch, nor did she lean into the gesture. She accepted it the way one accepts a business card, briefly, with measured civility. "Richard," she replied, her voice low but even. He studied her as they separated, eyes flicking over the pale blue dress. The way her hair was pinned neatly, and the gold band on her hand catching a slant of sun from the tall windows. Something almost imperceptible moved behind his smooth expression, a momentary crease of discomfort, perhaps even confusion. Then it was gone, replaced by the polished grin. "You look wonderful," he said lightly, "stronger than I expected." "Thank you." she said, and sat, letting him choose whether to follow. He did, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. The young associate drifted close enough to hover but not join, standing slightly behind Richard's right shoulder like a discreet valet. "Busy weeks," Richard went on, fingers tapping once against the table before stilling. "But I wanted to be here." "Of course I did." His eyes wandered across the room to the decorations, the flowers, the photo booth. "Quite a production, isn't it?" Elaine gave a small, agreeable sound and let the silence stretch after it. He seemed faintly unsettled by her stillness. She could feel him searching for easy entry points and finding none. "You're doing better, they say." He tried again, leaning forward slightly. "Therapy's working? Everyone treating you well?" She met his eyes for the first time then, long enough to register the flicker behind his own. "I'm getting stronger," she said. "And yes, I've learned a lot here." Something in her tone, mild but edged with layers he could not name, made him shift in his chair. The young associate glanced up and quickly away, sensing undercurrents. Richard smiled once more, a fraction tighter. "That's good. I'm glad." Around them the room was filling. Children laughing by the pastry table, nurses ferrying trays, the string quartet easing into a cheerful waltz. To anyone watching, they might look like any long-separated couple playing a pleasant reunion. But Elaine felt the reality pulse just under the surface. He was performing charm. She was permitting it, but not consuming it. She kept her hands folded, one finger resting lightly against the canvas toed at her feet. He didn't notice. His gaze swept the room, checking exits, measuring his own importance here. That was Richard's gift, appearing present while always half-turned toward the next deal. "You know," he said finally, gesturing vaguely toward the stage being set for speeches, "I could talk to the board here about making sure you have the best of everything. Graham's on it, of course." He smiled as though offering her comfort. "I know," she said quietly and let the words hang. Something flickered again in his eyes at the weight of her answer. But before he could chase it, applause rippled from the far side of the room as an aide announced the opening of the event. Richard turned his head toward the sound, grateful for the interruption. Elaine allowed herself the smallest inward breath, steady and cool. The first act was complete. The handshake, the kiss, the hollow charm accepted but not welcomed. She had met him on a stage and refused to play his part. She smoothed her dress, fingers brushing the gold ring once more, and waited for the next movement of the day to unfold. The binder rested silent but ready beneath the table's shadow. The great hall had never looked so polished. Overnight, the dull multipurpose room had been transformed with strings of pastel bunting hung in careful arcs across the low ceiling and clusters of helium balloons tethered to every other chair. The scent of polish and pastry mingled in the air. Someone had even wheeled in potted palms to soften the institutional beige. Folding tables now bore white cloths and platters of fruit cut into improbable shapes. By mid-morning, the place hummed with the low thrum of mingling families. Children darted between walkers and wheelchairs, squealing and laughing. Adult sons and daughters hovered awkwardly with cameras ready. Laughter rose and fell like a tide, punctuated by the squeak of chair brakes and the buzz of phones. Aides moved among them with trays of lemonade, smiling a shade too wide. Elaine entered quietly and found a seat near the front, where a row of padded chairs had been set for residents who could manage without help. She chose the center, not the edge. Her pale blue dress looked soft but deliberate under the hall's bright lights, her hair pinned neatly. She carried the canvas tote by its handles, setting it down as though it held only a sweater or knitting. Inside, the black binder rested flat across her knees once she sat, invisible but weighty. She kept one hand lightly atop it, as though anchoring herself. Across the room, the administrator hovered near a small podium outfitted with a microphone and the facility's logo taped hastily across the front. He was flushed with effort, but smiling broadly, greeting donors and well-dressed board members as they arrived. Elaine saw Graham Lockhart enter, taller than she remembered, hair silvered but still groomed to perfection. He shook hands with Richard, clapped him on the shoulder, laughed too loudly. Richard looked pleased, distracted, already performing camaraderie for the watching crowd. The staff had staged the space, so the front rows faced the podium, flanked by cameras for what looked like a casual promotional video. something to prove Willow Pines was thriving. Elaine wondered if they realized how transparent their show had become after the inspector's visit. Newly painted trim, rugs covering cracked linoleum, bouquets of grocery store roses masking antiseptic. The director, a broad man in a sharp navy suit, eventually climbed onto the low platform. He tapped the microphone and winced at the squeal before launching into welcome remarks. "We're so delighted to open our doors to all of you," he said, voice trained for warmth. "Here at Willow Pines, we strive every day to make this community safe, vibrant, and deeply connected to family." Polite applause rippled. Richard clapped lazily with one hand while checking his watch with the other. Elaine did not move more than necessary, her face composed and serene. The speech rolled on, full of phrases like innovative care and enhanced safety measures, each word gliding over the real fractures Elaine had chronicled for weeks. She listened but let her mind step aside, watching the effect instead of the content. Families smiled and nodded, charmed to hear that their loved ones were thriving. Staff exhaled in relief at each safe platitude. Behind the director, slides flickered onto a portable screen. Smiling residents in stage activities, spotless hallways, therapy sessions caught at flattering angles. Elaine caught her own image once in a wide shot from months ago, frail in a wheelchair at the edge of a baking class she hadn't really attended. She felt no sting, only a detached curiosity at how easily truth could be framed. Richard leaned closer during one round of applause, murmuring, "Good turnout. Glad I came." His breath smelled faintly of expensive coffee and mint. Elaine turned just enough to acknowledge him with a small nod, but her gaze stayed forward. A new speaker took the mic, a board member thanking families for trust and generosity. It was Graham Lockhart, smooth as ever. He spoke of financial stewardship and community, his eyes skimming the crowd like a man checking his stocks. When he mentioned our dear friend Richard Hale's ongoing support and confidence, Elaine felt the smallest shift in her chest, not rage, but recognition of the neat web they thought invisible. She sat straighter, one palm sliding across the cool cover of her binder. Calm flooded her again, the same clarity she'd built night by night. They were presenting a version of safety, and she was sitting here with the counter-narrative fully prepared. Not to shout, not perform, but to be ready when the moment cracked open. Behind her, Sam lurked at the edge of the volunteer cluster, cameras slung awkwardly, pretending to film but really watching her. When their eyes met briefly, his look carried quiet encouragement. The program went on. Thank yous, cheerful stories, more slides. Elaine's breathing stayed slow. She was not impatient. She had waited far longer than this for recognition. The morning light poured through high windows, catching the ring on her left hand and throwing a small glint onto black vinyl binder. She felt it pulse like a signal, only she understood. Soon enough there would be mingling, photos, and an opening for quiet conversations. She imagined Susan slipping into the room any moment, watchful and poised, and the thought steadied her further. The machine of appearance churned on at the podium, but she was no longer inside it. She was positioned just outside, armed and waiting, serene as a stone set deliberately in a fast-moving stream. It began softly, almost too softly to catch. The director had just finished his last rehearsed thank you and invited families to share a word or two of gratitude. The open microphone was meant for warm anecdotes, for children praised nurses and spouses to say how grateful they were. A few went first, a grandson thanking the kitchen staff for extra desserts, a daughter choking up about how her father felt safe here. The room warmed with applause and tissue dabs. Elaine waited until the lull stretched just long enough for someone brave to fill it. Then she rose. The movement was quiet but distinct. A pale blue dress against rows of beige and gray, a woman upright, thin but balanced. She did not lean on her chair. For an instant the room's hum shifted, tiny as the pause before a key change. "I'd like to speak," she said. Her voice was calm, not loud, but carried. The director beamed, relief flashing across his face. Another gentle testimonial, he assumed. Richard half-turned, faint surprise in his eyes. Graham Lockhart's head swiveled like a weather vane. Elaine stepped forward with measured grace, canvas tote over one arm. At the podium, she smiled faintly at the director and then at the microphone, as if greeting an old friend. "First, I want to thank the people here who have shown real care." She looked directly at Nurse Carl in the back, at the night aide who hummed. "There are individuals who make this place bearable. You know who you are. I am grateful." Soft claps started and died quickly because she had not stepped away. She rested the tote on the podium shelf and drew out the black binder. The gesture was small but precise, and the room's air thinned at once. "But gratitude," she continued, "does not erase harm." The first page lifted, a clean invoice in a plastic sleeve. "This," she said evenly, "is my own billing statement. It includes charges for therapy sessions never provided." Another page, another invoice, side by side. "This is Mrs. Talbot's. Premium meals charged on weeks. She ate the same menu we all did." A photo now. The broken break, stark and undeniable. "This chair failed and caused injury. The incident report claims otherwise." Murmurs swelled, then hushed themselves. Elaine's voice stayed measured, anchored. "I have documented medication delays. I have records of valuables missing, complaints silenced, and a locked cabinet of altered charts." Another page, and the board list appeared, Lockhart's face bright and damning in its corporate gloss. "Here is your finance committee, including Graham Lockhart, longtime business associate of my husband, Richard Hale. That relationship helped fast-track my admission and secure lucrative care package upgrades, at whose benefit I leave for you to judge." Now a ripple of true noise, gasps, whispered names, someone's phone camera rising. Richard half rose and sat, jaw tightening. Graham flushed darkly, his polished smile gone. Elaine did not rush. She turned each page as if reciting liturgy, holding it high for cameras and eyes. "The state has already been contacted," she said, voice cool but clear. "Investigators have visited, but families deserve truth before more harm is done." The director tried to move forward, a step, a hand out, but hesitated when Susan Ortega's voice cut across the air. "Let her finish." The lawyer had slipped in unnoticed and now stood near the second row, calm and unyielding, badge of authority carried not by uniform but presence. Elaine closed the binder gently but left it on the podium. "I was left here quietly, as many of us are. We are not powerless. We can see. We can remember." Her gaze swept the room, not accusing, not pleading, just steady. Then she stepped back from the microphone and returned to her seat. For a breathless moment, nothing happened. Then the sound came, scattered claps that grew into a heavy, rolling applause. Not the cheerful kind from earlier, but slow, deliberate, pulsing with something like anger and respect entwined. Residents tapped canes. Families rose to their feet. Aides glanced at each other wide-eyed. Richard stayed seated, expression shuttered but pale. Graham looked away, phone in hand but useless. The director stood frozen, mouth opening and closing around lost words. Elaine sat with hands folded in her lap, binder still on the podium, her wedding ring catching light. She had not shouted or raged. She had simply laid down truth, page after page, until it filled the room and could not be ignored. Sam leaned against the back wall, eyes shining with fierce pride. Marjorie dabbed at tears with a tissue she pretended not to need. In the charged quiet that followed, no one seemed to know what to do next, and that was enough. Elaine did not need to control the aftermath. She had set it in motion. She looked forward calmly, heart steady, and felt the first true breath of freedom she'd had in months. For a few seconds after Elaine sat down, the hall seemed suspended, caught between old choreography and a new, unscripted thing breaking through. Then a small mechanical click broke the stillness, the sound of a camera shutter. Another followed, sharper, deliberate. Heads turned toward the back of the room where two people with press badges were already standing, cameras raised, lenses trained on the podium where Elaine's black binder lay like a quiet bomb. Richard's had snapped toward the sound, and something happened to his face that Elaine had not seen in years. A raw, unguarded flicker. Color drained so fast it seemed to leave him hollow, lips parting as if to speak, and then shutting when he caught himself. He looked left and right, searching for explanation, but there was none. The journalists were young, brisk, and confident. One wore the Metro Gazette lanyard Elaine had memorized from her research. Susan stood nearby, arms folded, the faintest knowing tilt to her chin. Richard's hand went instinctively to his phone. He stared at the screen but didn't unlock it, perhaps too aware of eyes on him. The junior associate behind him leaned down to whisper something, but Richard waved him off without looking, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped. Across the aisle, Graham Lockhart shifted in his seat, adjusting his tie with a jerky motion. His smile was long gone. Sweat slicked the edge of his hairline. Another board member ducked his head and began texting furiously, the glow of the screen harsh against his pale fingers. Aides froze mid-aisle, unsure whether to continue serving drinks or retreat. The director at the podium was trying to recover, stammering about continuing our celebration of family and safety. His voice wobbled and cracked. He cut his own sentence short when a journalist asked, not loud but clearly enough to carry, "Can we get a statement on the allegations just presented?" Elaine did not move, her eyes on nothing and everything at once. The room seemed to ripple with a strange, slow comprehension. Families turned to each other, whispering. Some rose from chairs, craning for better sight lines. One older man lifted his phone to start recording. Richard's pale mask darkened with something beyond embarrassment, a dawning recognition that this was no controlled annoyance he could outlast with charm. The press was here. The press had been invited. He looked toward Susan then, and their eyes met across the crowded hall. Hers was calm and cool, a lawyer's gaze taking full measure. His broke first. He glanced away, shoulders drawing tight as if bracing for a blow. The administrator tried again, calling for applause to honor our residents. No one clapped. The silence was worse than boos. Richard turned back to Elaine finally, and for the first time there was no performance left. His face had collapsed into something stark and unfamiliar. Fear, yes, but threaded with an older, deeper thing. The sudden awareness of exposure. He opened his mouth once, closed it, then leaned toward her and whispered, hoarse enough she barely caught it. "What have you done?" She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her hands remained folded, the ring glinting, her gaze forward. Around them phones buzzed like a nest of bees. Board members muttered into sleeves. The journalists conferred quietly, lifting cameras again for more shots of the podium and the silent, composed woman who had shattered the script. Richard's junior associate took a half step backward, face flushed, as if realizing he was witnessing the undoing of a man's carefully kept fortress. Graham leaned forward, whispering to another board member, but the other man shook his head hard and looked away. Susan moved closer to Elaine's row, not intruding, only standing near, a quiet pillar. The lawyer's presence was a warning and a shield at once. The director's voice broke again under the weight of the room. We're proud of our transparency and will, of course, review any concerns raised. His smile looked like wet paper about to tear. Richard's eyes closed for a second, a man swallowing bile. When he opened them, something final had entered. The knowledge that the day was lost, that would have been meant as a photo op, would now become a headline. He looked older suddenly, every careful grooming undone by the sag of his jaw and the sheen of sweat at his temples. Elaine sat still and serene. She had not moved since her speech. She would not move now. There was no need to gloat or defend. The evidence lay in plain sight. The watchers were already doing the work she'd hoped. She let the silence hang, unhurried, while the weight of cameras and murmured calls pressed harder into the fragile theater Richard had built. For the first time in a long while, she felt taller than him, though she hadn't stood. She simply breathed, and the air belonged to her. The moment the director's voice faltered, the room's fragile order broke for good. It began with one clear, steady question from back, a young woman's voice carrying easily without need for microphone. "Mr. Hale," she said, "did you approve these budget cuts?" Richard's head snapped toward the sound. The journalist stepped forward, badge swinging, pen poised over a reporter's notebook. Behind her, a second photographer raised a camera, its lens glinting like an eye. "I'm sorry," Richard said, voice a notch too high. His usual smooth baritone was gone, replaced by something thin, almost breathless. The reporter didn't flinch. "The documents your wife presented show cost-saving directives tied to board recommendations." Your name is associated with Willow Pines through Mr. Lockhart. Did you sign off on those measures? Dozens of heads turned toward him, phones tilted upward. Someone whispered audibly, "Budget cuts." Richard opened his mouth, closed it, and finally managed, "I don't handle operational decisions here." His voice aimed for casual, but cracked at the edges. Another question came before he could recover. A man in a plaid shirt, older but sure of himself, stepped closer, phone recording in his lifted hand. "Mr. Hale, did your company profit from service upgrades charged to residents like your wife? We're seeing invoices tied to Hale and Lockhart Consulting." The word struck like stones skipping across still water. Graham Lockhart visibly stiffened 2 rows back. Richard looked at him as though for rescue. Graham looked away. Richard tried to speak, to reclaim footing. "Our firm consults broadly in healthcare," he said, the pat phrase stumbling out. "But any profit is indirect. I mean, this is a personal matter." "Personal?" The first reporter cut in, sharper now. "Mrs. Hale's billing shows fraud. Are you aware these practices violate state elder care statutes?" Flash. Another photo taken. Richard blinked against it, sweating under the hall's lights. "I can't comment on legal," he began, but was drowned by a murmur swelling into full voices. Families, once passive, were standing, murmuring to one another, turning cell cameras on him. "You sent her here?" someone said aloud, shocked and angry. Elaine stayed seated, eyes forward, hands folded, ring catching light. She neither flinched nor turned toward him. Her stillness was louder than the shouts. Susan moved subtly closer to her table, one hand resting on the tote like a silent promise. Her presence was protective and deliberate. No one would steer the questions back to small talk now. The director tried to intervene, raising both hands. "Let's remember why we're here, to celebrate." But the young journalist cut him off, stepping toward the mic. "We are here because families were invited to celebrate safety. Evidence now suggests harm and fraud. Mr. Hale, do you deny that?" Richard's jaw worked, but no words came. Cameras caught every flicker, the flush at his collar, the darting glance toward the exit, the way his polished charm collapsed under public scrutiny. Somewhere behind the journalist, Graham muttered sharply to another board member and began texting again, face set like stone. The administrator's hands fluttered near the mic, unsure whether to wrest it back or disappear. One more question, quieter but deadlier, came from a mother with her hand on her father's wheelchair. "Would you have put her here if it wasn't profitable for you?" It landed like a blow. Richard's mouth opened and shut once, and then he simply sat, colorless. His junior associate bent close to whisper, but Richard pushed him off with a small, frantic gesture. Click. Another photograph. Click. Elaine let her breath move slow and steady, the way she had trained herself in sleepless nights. She had not asked for this chorus. She had only laid down truth. The world had picked it up faster than she expected. The director finally found his voice, trembling with panic. "This concludes our—" "No!" the first reporter said sharply. "This begins an inquiry. We'll be following up." She turned to Elaine and gave the smallest nod, acknowledgement and respect without show. Richard looked at his wife at last, truly looked, and there was no shield left on his face, only shock and a helpless anger he could not aim anywhere safe. Elaine returned his gaze for one brief, still second. Then she looked away, a small act of sovereignty. The room didn't settle again. Conversation surged. Cameras kept flashing. Phones buzzed with texts and calls already flying out of the hall. Elaine knew headlines were being drafted even as she sat. Local care home accused of fraud at family day event. Executive silent. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply reached down, adjusted the toe to her feet, and sat straighter, pale blue against a sea of restless movement. Around her, the truth had broken free, and it no longer needed her voice to sustain it. The ripples began the same afternoon. The press left the gathering hall. Elaine did not follow the coverage. She had no appetite for headlines, but the world arrived anyway in small fragments. Whispered updates from Marjorie, a nurse muttering that lawyers were on site, Sam bringing her a folded newspaper because you should see this. She glanced only once at the front page. Local care home faces fraud probe. Executive silent. Her own silhouette faint in the photo, head bowed, binder in lap. Then she tucked the paper away and went back to tea. But the quiet world outside did not go back. Within days, the state's Department of Health confirmed a formal investigation. Inspectors returned, this time with cameras and clipboards thick with subpoenas. The administrator's office door stayed shut, blinds drawn. Staff moved with brittle courtesy. Some were replaced overnight. Residents whisper of records being seized, of hard drives removed in unmarked boxes. 2 weeks later, the Gazette headline arrived. State moves TO suspend Willow Pine's license. Patient transfers planned. Elaine read that one slowly. The article listed findings. Falsified incident reports, unapproved billing, safety violations. It mentioned a resident whistleblower, but no name. That anonymity felt like a quiet gift from Susan and the reporters. She learned through Marjorie that families were banding together, forming a legal group, lawsuits for negligence, fraud, emotional distress. Some had already secured counsel, names she recognized from Susan's world. The once proud board fractured in real time. Graham Lockhart resigned within days of suspension notice, issuing a single tight statement about personal reasons. Richard's name appeared further down. Hale and Lockhart consulting to sever healthcare ties amid scandal. Investors fled almost immediately. Sam, gleeful and careful at once, showed her a business news snippet on his phone. Regional firm loses major contracts after nursing home probe. Richard's smiling headshot, stock photo perfect, now carried a caption about loss of confidence. Elaine read none of it in full. She didn't need to. The essence reached her like distant thunder. Things long untouchable were shifting because the silence had broken. Life inside Willow Pines changed too, though unevenly. The worst staff left quietly. The ones who'd always cared stayed and stood a little taller. Nurse Carla visited one evening with real flowers and a quiet thank you she didn't explain. Meals improved. Hallways smelled of bleach and lemon instead of stale air, and safety checks happened in the open, not whispered or hidden. Residents noticed. So did Elaine. One afternoon, Susan returned, crisp in navy, and they sat by the courtyard glass while the lawyer gave a low, careful summary. They're folding, Susan said. The state will shut this place down for overhaul. You'll be moved to a reputable facility or home with care, your choice. Class actions are forming, you're protected. Richard's firm is bleeding money. He's trying to spin it, but the contracts are gone. Elaine listened, quiet as always. She didn't ask about revenge or payback. She only said, good. Susan studied her friend's face for a long moment. You understand you did this? I told the truth, Elaine said softly. That's rarer than you think, Susan replied, and reached across to squeeze her hand once before standing. Weeks stretched on. Paperwork came and went, but for once not as a trap. It was protection now, real oversight. Residents' families dropped by to thank Elaine quietly. A nod, a flower left by her door, a murmured, "You saved my father." She accepted it without speeches. As summer bent toward August, she began to walk the courtyard each evening. She still wore the pale blue dress sometimes, still kept a ledger though new pages stayed mostly blank. It wasn't about building a case anymore. It was about reclaiming space. News of Richard reached her indirectly. Property listings, firm layoffs, a photograph of him looking thinner, caught by a business photographer outside his office. She felt neither triumph nor pity, only distance. The man who drove her through rain to this place had tried to bury her in quiet. She had answered with quiet of her own, heavier and patient. One evening she sat under the string lights the staff had hung to soften the last weeks before transfer. Sam played a slow tune on his guitar for whoever wanted to listen. Marjorie dozed in the next chair, hands folded. Elaine sipped tea and looked at the stars beginning to show above the dark pines. Inside, Willow Pines was crumbling, legally, structurally, but out here the air felt almost gentle. She had not shouted or burned anything down. She had simply refused to disappear, and that refusal had grown teeth once truth found daylight. Tomorrow she would begin planning where to go next. She didn't know yet, perhaps her own small apartment. perhaps near Susan. What mattered was choice, a word she had almost forgotten she could claim. Somewhere far away, Richard was fighting for relevance, headlines devouring the empire built on distance and calculation. She thought of him only briefly, then let the thought drift away like the night insects rising from the grass. She closed her ledger one last time and set it aside, no longer a shield but a testament. A thin wind stirred the trees. For the first time in a long while, she felt not just safe but free. The morning of her departure broke, clear and cool, the air washed clean by a night rain. Sunlight spilled across the courtyard where she had spent so many long hours measuring silence. For once the building felt hushed not with fear, but with the odd calm that follows upheaval. The front desk bustled with staff she recognized, but who now met her gaze directly, without that old veil of dismissal. They knew who she was now. Elaine sat near the lobby's wide glass doors, a small overnight bag tucked neatly at her feet, the tote with its black binder zipped shut and resting across her lap. The binder no longer felt like a weapon. It was simply part of her, a record of survival she might never open again, but could not abandon. Her discharge papers lay signed and sealed inside a folder marked with the state's crest. Protective orders. Susan had called them. Assurances that no one could interfere with her transition or alter her care plan. Sam arrived just before 9, breathless from hurrying across the lot. Guitar case slung as usual but empty today. Instead, he brought only himself and an eager steadiness. "You ready?" he asked, grin flickering. She smiled faintly. "Yes." He adjusted the wheelchair footrest with gentle precision, every motion careful. "Got your stuff?" "Just this." She touched the tote. "Good," he said, and knelt briefly to check the brakes, a small gesture that made her throat tighten with quiet affection. Then he wheeled her toward the door. As they moved, staff paused and nod or offered small waves. Nurse Carla leaned out from behind the station, eyes bright. "Be safe, Mrs. Hale." "Thank you." Another aide pressed a paper cup of coffee into Sam's free hand and squeezed Elaine's shoulder. They didn't use big words, but their gratitude hummed in the air like unseen music. When they reached the broad front window, Marjorie was there, propped in her chair by a young nurse. She lifted one thin arm and waggled her fingers, a wry grin curving her mouth. Elaine lifted her hand in return, palm open against the glass from her side. No words passed, but everything that needed saying lived in that quiet farewell. Shared vigilance, shared victory. Outside, the world looked larger than she remembered. Cars shimmered under clean light. At the edge of the lot stood a dark sedan she recognized before her mind would name it. Richard leaned against the hood, jacket immaculate, sunglasses off this time. Without the old entourage or cameras, he seemed smaller, edges dulled. Sam slowed, but didn't stop. Elaine said softly, "Keep going." But as they drew closer, Richard straightened, uncertainty plain on his face. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but had lost the script. His hands hung empty. His polished stance faltered under the weight of everything undone. "Elaine," he called once, almost tentative. She didn't answer, didn't break her calm. She turned her head just enough to acknowledge that she had heard him, nothing more. No anger, no triumph. Only the clear boundary of someone who had reclaimed herself. He opened his mouth again, closed it. His eyes searched her face for something, forgiveness, explanation, and found only serenity. It seemed to unmoor him further. He looked down, shoved his hands into his pockets like a man suddenly without anchor. Sam pushed on, quiet but certain. At the waiting vehicle, a car arranged by Susan's office, its driver respectful and anonymous. Elaine rose slowly, leaning on the arm Sam offered. She moved with dignity, unhurried but unassisted once she had her balance. Before stepping in, she turned for a final glance at the building. The windows where she had watched the world, the door through which she was now walking free. Marjorie's palm still rested on the glass. Elaine lifted her own once more in salute. Her gaze did not linger on Richard. Just a brief, cool flicker across the lot. Not cruel, simply done. Then she ducked into the car, tote on her lap, and closed the door with a soft, final click. Sam tapped the roof twice in goodbye, a gesture so gentle it felt ceremonial. The car eased away, tires whispering on wet gravel. Elaine looked forward, not back, as the building and the man in years of imposed silence receded behind her. The ride out was quiet, but not heavy. The window beside her reflected a woman composed, pale blue still bright in the morning light. Her hand lay across the tote, but lightly now, not guarding, just keeping company with what brought her here. As the gate swung open and the road widened, she drew a long, slow breath. It filled her whole chest, unbroken, and when she let it out, it carried months of weight away with it. She did not know exactly where this new road led. Susan's guest apartment for now, perhaps a small place of her own later. But for the first time in a long time, the future belonged wholly to her. Morning came gently in the new place, a slow wash of light spilling through glass, so clear and wide she felt at first as though she'd stepped in the sky. The apartment wasn't grand, one bedroom, small kitchen, but it breathed. Real air moved here. Sun reached deep into the rooms instead of filtering through a single courtyard pane. Elaine stood barefoot at the window and let it warm her skin, quiet except for the faint hum of the city below and the kettle beginning to stir on the stove. Boxes were gone now, stacked away or broken down. Susan had helped her find this place, a converted brick building with a lift and wide hallways. It felt safe but not confining, private but not secret. The first night she slept with the curtains half open, just to see the moon without obstruction. Now, on her second morning alone, she found herself tracing the walls with her eyes as though memorizing proof. These windows opened. These doors locked and unlocked at her own hand. On the kitchen counter, the black binder sat closed, edges square and silent. She had moved it last night from the suitcase into a small cedar chest she brought from storage, along with the leather ledger. Both rested there now, not hidden but no longer needed as armor. They were record, not weight. She touched the binder once on her way past, a light acknowledgement, then left it. The kettle whistled, a clean, bright sound. She lifted it and poured steaming water over a single bag of tea, watching the amber bloom. The simplicity of the act felt luxurious. Her own stove, her own cup, no scheduled rounds, no interruptions. The scent rose into the quiet, and she realized she was humming, soft and tuneless. She carried the tea to the broad table by the largest window. Outside, traffic passed but softly muted by glass. A child on the sidewalk tugged at a dog's leash. 2 bicycles glided past. The ordinariness was almost startling after so much constructive performance. She sat and let the steam fog her glasses, then sipped and closed her eyes. In the corner stood a chair she'd chosen herself. Pale wood with a cushion, in that same blue she'd worn on Family Day. Beside it a small stack of books, novels, essays, waiting without demand. On the far wall hung a framed photograph Sam had given her before she left. The courtyard at dusk, pine silhouetted against a washed-out sky. He'd signed the back, keep looking out. She thought of Margarine away from the window, of Nurse Carla's whispered thank you, of Susan's steady voice promising, "You're not alone." She thought briefly of Richard, a shadow now somewhere behind headlines and unraveling deals, and felt no wish for revenge, only distance, clean and entire. Elaine looked again at the cedar chest. She didn't need to open it. The story it held had already done its work. Now other stories could begin, ones with no ledger at their heart. The kettle cooled. The tea grew stronger. Sun shifted higher and painted long rectangles of light across the floorboards. She rose and opened the nearest window wide. Air moved through at once. Summer warm, faint scent of bakery from the street below. She closed her eyes and let it touch her face. A life reclaimed did not feel like fireworks. It felt like this. The whistle of her own kettle, the weight of a door she alone had turned the key to, the stretch of open windows where she could watch the world and choose when to step out. She set the cup down, smoothed the tablecloth with her palm, and let silence fill the room. Not the sterile silence of being put away, but the living quiet one builds intentionally. It was hers now, every inch.